He was nobody. A tired man in a wrinkled shirt, holding a stack of papers nobody cared about, sitting next to a woman who owned half the supply chain in America. She was about to lose everything, and she didn't even know it yet. 40,000 contracts, 11 hospitals, $3 billion bleeding out quietly through cracks nobody had bothered to look at. And the only person who could see it had just fallen asleep on her shoulder at 35,000 feet. This is the story of how one wrong seat on a late-night flight changed 2 lives and saved thousands more. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because what happens in part 5 will hit you somewhere you didn't expect. The airport smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Gate B14 at O'Hare was half empty at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, which was usually the only good thing about catching a late flight. Fewer people meant fewer delays, fewer babies screaming in the jetway, fewer businessmen blocking the overhead bins while they pretended not to notice the line behind them. Mason Reed had been in that gate for 47 minutes, and in that time, he had eaten a $6 bag of pretzels, returned 2 phone calls he'd been putting off since Monday, and reread the same paragraph in a routing analysis report 4 times without absorbing a single word of it. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't really fix anymore. Not just physically tired, though that was certainly part of it. His back had been bothering him since last Thursday, when he'd spent 6 hours crouched over a warehouse floor in Cincinnati, helping a regional distribution manager trace where a batch of refrigerated pharmaceuticals had gone missing between intake and dispatch. They'd found the problem eventually. A mislabeled priority code buried in a software update nobody had properly tested. 48 units of insulin that had sat at room temperature for 19 hours before anyone caught it. Nobody got hurt that time. Mason always thought about that. That time. Like there was a scorecard somewhere he kept updating. He folded the report and shoved it into the side pocket of his bag, then leaned back in the hard plastic chair and looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent lighting in gate B14 had that particular shade of yellow-white that made everyone look vaguely ill. A woman across from him was asleep with her mouth open, one shoe half off her foot. A teenager 2 rows down was watching something on his phone, with the volume just low enough to be annoying without being loud enough to complain about. Mason checked his watch. 11:34. He thought about Eli. That was the thing about being tired. His brain would wander straight to his son without asking permission. Eli was 11 now, which still sometimes blindsided Mason when he thought about it too hard. 11. He remembered holding that kid in the hospital, this terrifying small thing that weighed less than a bag of potting soil, and thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing. 12 years later, he still mostly felt that way, except now Eli could look him in the eye and occasionally correct his math homework, which was somehow both devastating and the best thing that had ever happened to him. Eli was staying with Mason's neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, for the week. She was 71, made excellent pierogi, and treated Eli with a combination of strict affection and absolute patience that Mason genuinely envied. She'd been covering for him since the divorce. Since before the divorce, honestly, when things were still technically together but falling apart in slow motion. He didn't think about the divorce much anymore. Or he tried not to. It had been 3 years, and the paperwork was done. And the reason it happened was something he'd accepted without entirely forgiving himself for. He worked too much. He was absent when he was present. He cared more about other people's broken systems than his own. That was the thing about Mason Reed, man. He was genuinely, almost compulsively good at his job, and that gift had cost him things he couldn't get back. He pulled out his phone and sent Eli a text. On the late flight back. Should land by 1. Mrs. K knows. You good? 3 seconds later. Dad. It's midnight, go to sleep. Mason laughed. Actually laughed. Alone in gate B14 at 11:34 at night, in front of a woman sleeping with her shoe falling off and a teenager who definitely judged him. He put the phone away and picked the report back up. The boarding announcement came at 11:52, 18 minutes late, which the gate agent delivered with the specific energy of someone who knew the delay was not their fault and was not going to apologize for it anyway. Mason was in Group C, which meant he waited through Group A, the elites and the families, and Group B, the people who'd paid extra for better seats. before shuffling forward in a line that moved with the momentum of a glacier. He found his seat. 24C aisle. The overhead bin above 24C was already full, which he'd expected, so he hoisted his bag into the bin 3 rows back and worked his way to his seat. The middle seat was occupied by a large man in his 50s who was already locked into a pair of noise-canceling headphones and radiating the specific body language of someone who would not be making eye contact for the duration of this flight. Fine. Good, even. The window seat was empty when Mason sat down. He got settled, laptop bag under the seat, report on his lap, jacket folded and jammed in the seat back pocket because he'd need it when he landed, and New York in November was not interested in your feelings about temperature. He tilted his seat back the 1 inch that airline seats technically allowed and stared at the report in his lap. Delivery systems. Reliability failures in medical supply chains, Q2 to Q4. It wasn't his company's report. He was a consultant, independent, which meant he went where the problem was and charged for his time and didn't have to pretend to care about anyone's corporate culture beyond what was functionally necessary. He'd been hired by a smaller firm in Cincinnati to dig into the failures, but the data kept pointing upstream to the larger logistics providers who were moving the bulk of the product. The name Ashford Logistics kept appearing in the chain. It kept appearing in the failure column. Mason had circled it twice in red and written a note in the margin, not asking the right questions. He didn't know yet who that note was about to matter to. The woman slid into 24A about 30 seconds before the cabin door closed. Mason noticed her the way he noticed most things, peripherally, cataloging details without making it obvious. She was maybe 30, give or take. Dark blazer, good fabric, the kind that didn't wrinkle the way his shirts did. Hair pulled back, but not formally. More like she'd pulled it up fast in a bathroom somewhere and hadn't thought about it since. She had a leather portfolio tucked under one arm and was carrying a coffee cup from the airport that was almost certainly cold by now. What Mason noticed most was that she looked tired in exactly the same way he did. Not runway tired, not the photogenic exhaustion that people post on social media. Actual tired. The kind that lived behind the eyes and made everything slightly slower. She sat down without looking at either of her seatmates, opened the portfolio, started reading. Mason looked back at his own report. The man in 24B fell asleep somewhere over Indiana. Mason could tell because the subtle defensive tension in the man's shoulders relaxed, and he stopped holding his arms quite so tightly against his body. The cabin lights dimmed 30 minutes in. Most people around them settled. Someone up in row 14 was having a conversation in a loud whisper that wasn't actually a whisper, and the flight attendant had already come through once to ask them to keep it down. Mason read. He made notes, he circled things. He did not sleep, because he never slept on flights, because something about pressurized cabins at altitude made his brain decide this was an excellent time to work through everything he'd been putting off, including the routing failures in Section 4 of the report, including Eli's parent-teacher conference next week that he had not rescheduled yet, including the fact that the left rear tire on his car needed to be checked before winter really set in. He read. And then, somewhere over Pennsylvania, without any intention or warning, the report slid off his lap. He woke up with a jolt, the kind of waking up where you don't know where you are for about 3 full seconds. The cabin was quiet. The lights were still dim. The man in 24B was still asleep, and Mason's head was not where it was supposed to be. He became aware of this fact in stages. First the warmth, then the smell of something, a perfume or maybe just a shampoo, cedar, and something light, barely there. Then the stillness, the particular stillness of someone who is trying very hard not to move. He was on someone's shoulder. He sat up so fast he knocked his elbow on the armrest and made a sound that was mostly a word, and partly just noise. I am so sorry. It's fine. Her voice was even, not annoyed, not amused, just even. Mason pressed himself back against his own seat and spent a moment being thoroughly mortified. I don't sleep on flights. I don't know how that... You had a report in your lap. She picked it up from where it had slid between the seats, glanced at it, and handed it back. You were reading it when I fell asleep. I assumed you'd be fine. He took it. You fell asleep? For about 40 minutes. She said it like this was slightly embarrassing information she was releasing only because it was relevant. I woke up when we hit turbulence over the Alleghenies. You didn't. Mason looked at the report in his hands, then at her. How long was I? About 25 minutes. I'm sorry. You apologized already. I'm apologizing again. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. You're very thorough about your apologies. He exhaled, looked at his watch. They were probably 40 minutes from landing. I genuinely don't do that. I have never done that on a plane. There's a first time for everything. He looked at the report again. What did you... when you woke up, you were out cold, snoring a little. Mason closed his eyes briefly. Great. Not loudly. That's marginally better. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. I'm Mason. She looked at him the way people look at someone who's just extended a hand across a line they weren't sure existed. A small calculation, fast and quiet. Then, Victoria. I really am sorry, Victoria. Mason. She picked up her portfolio. You already apologized twice. 3 times gets weird. He should have left it there. Normal human behavior dictated that you apologize to the stranger, you go back to your respective silences, and you deplane separately and never think about it again. But the report was in his hands, and the name Ashford Logistics was circled in red, and somewhere in the tired and slightly mortified part of his brain, something connected that he should have connected earlier. Victoria Ashford. He didn't know her face. He'd never had reason to know it. But he knew the name. He'd been reading it in failure columns for 2 weeks. He almost said nothing. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the page, and then he said, without quite deciding to, Can I ask you something? About logistics. She looked up. I'm not selling anything, he said. I'm a consultant, independent. I've been working through some supply chain data, and I keep running into the same problem, and Do you know anything about routing systems? She was quiet for 2 full seconds. A little, she said. The way most companies structure their routing, Mason said, they're optimizing for cost, right? Shortest path, cheapest carrier, maximum load. It's intuitive. It makes the numbers look good on a quarterly report. Yes? But when you're moving time-sensitive medical product, insulin, oncology medications, anything with a temperature requirement or an expiration window, cost-optimized routing is almost always the wrong metric. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the report. Because the cheapest route is usually the one with the most transfer points, the most handoffs, the most opportunities for delay. And a delay on a standard package is an inconvenience. A delay on a refrigerated pharmaceutical is potentially... He stopped. Sorry, you didn't ask for a lecture. No, Victoria said. Keep going. He glanced at her. Her face had changed. Not dramatically. It wasn't a movie moment, but the blankness was gone. She was paying attention the way people pay attention when something has touched a nerve they didn't know was exposed. Most companies, Mason continued, when they're looking at their failure data, they ask, what went wrong? And that's a fine question, but the more useful question is, what assumptions built the system that allowed this to go wrong? Because the individual failure is usually just a symptom. The underlying problem is always in the design. Victoria was quiet. Most companies never ask the second question, Mason said. They're too focused on fixing the symptom to look at the structure underneath it. The seatbelt sign chimed on. The pilot came on the intercom to announce their descent into LaGuardia. Victoria looked at the report in Mason's hands. What company is that about? He hesitated, looked at the circled name, thought about whether to say it. Not any one company specifically, he said. It's a pattern I keep seeing across multiple providers. He looked at her. But one of them comes up more than the others. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said carefully, Which one? He looked at the page, then back at her. Ashford Logistics. The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long, which in conversation time is significant. I see, Victoria said. Victoria Ashford, Mason said. I should have connected that sooner. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing. Her voice was flat in a way that didn't sound angry. It sounded like someone absorbing information that they're not sure yet how to process. Tell me what you found. I'm not sure this is the right time. Tell me what you found. So he told her. Not all of it. There wasn't time before landing, and anyway, he wasn't sure yet what she'd do with it. But he sketched the outline. The pattern of reliability failures concentrated in the medical contracts, the cost optimization routing that kept routing time-sensitive freight through high-failure nodes, the way the numbers were structured in the quarterly reports to obscure what was actually happening if you looked at raw completion rates versus reported performance metrics. He did not tell her about the suppressed warnings yet. He didn't know about those yet. He was going off the data, not the politics. Victoria listened. She didn't interrupt. She took no notes, just sat very still with her portfolio on her lap and her cold airport coffee in the seat-back pocket and listened. The wheels came down. The runway lights of LaGuardia appeared in the window behind her. You said companies are asking the wrong question, she said. What's the right question? He thought about it for a second. Your routing systems. Do they optimize for cost or for reliability? She was quiet. That's the question, Mason said. The plane landed with a bump. The cabin lights came on full. The man in 24B woke up and immediately began reaching for the overhead bin before they'd stopped moving, like every person who has ever flown in a middle seat. Victoria reached into her portfolio and produced a business card. She held it out. Come to my office tomorrow, she said. 9 o'clock. He looked at the card. Victoria Ashford, CEO, Ashford Logistics Group. I have a flight back to Chicago at 2, he said. Then we have 5 hours. She held his gaze with the particular directness of someone who had spent a lot of time making decisions. Will you come? Mason Reed looked at the business card. He thought about the routing failures. He thought about the insulin sitting at room temperature for 19 hours in Cincinnati. He thought about the pattern he'd been chasing for 2 weeks that kept leading to the same name. He thought about Eli, asleep in Mrs. Kowalski's spare room. Yeah, he said. I'll come. He didn't sleep on the cab ride to his hotel. He sat in the back of a yellow cab that smelled like pine air freshener and French fries, watching Midtown Manhattan slide past the window at midnight, and he thought. He was good at this. The thinking part. Always had been. His mother used to call it his problem brain when he was a kid, the way he couldn't let a broken thing stay broken, the way puzzles were less interesting to solve once he understood the mechanism. He'd driven his ex-wife, Claire, absolutely insane with it, the way he'd fixate on a logistics problem at 2 in the morning and not be able to turn it off, the way he'd come back from a consulting job physically present but mentally still in someone else's warehouse, tracing the path of a package that hadn't gone where it was supposed to go. You care more about other people's broken systems than your own. She hadn't said it cruelly. That was the thing. She'd said it as an observation, almost sad, because she'd loved him, and she'd known it was true, and she'd understood before he did that the combination of those two things was not going to work long term. He wasn't thinking about Claire now. He was thinking about Ashford Logistics. The card was in his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone and Googled her. There was plenty. Victoria Ashford, 30, named CEO of Ashford Logistics Group 18 months ago after the death of her father, Richard Ashford, who had founded the company in 1987. The company had grown substantially under Richard, national reach, major healthcare contracts, distribution partnerships across 22 states. Victoria had come up through the company's finance and strategy divisions, which meant she understood the numbers but was still learning the operational side. That tracked with what he'd heard in the conversation. The way she'd listened, the way she'd asked, what's the right question instead of defending the system. She knew something was wrong, she just didn't know what. That was a specific kind of difficult, knowing something is broken and not being able to see where. Mason looked at his reflection in the cab window. Tired. Hair needed a cut. The kind of face that was easy to overlook in a crowd, which he had generally found useful in his line of work. You asked better questions when people didn't see you coming. He pulled up his notes app and started writing. Things she doesn't know yet. He paused. He typed, how bad it actually is. Bassem, He called Mrs. Kowalski at 6:30 in the morning, New York time, because he knew she'd be up and because he felt guilty about the possibility of extending the trip. "He's fine," she said immediately, before he'd asked. "He ate 2 bowls of cereal for breakfast, and he's been awake since 5:30 reading that library book about bridges." "Bridges?" "Civil engineering. He wants to know how the Brooklyn Bridge was built." There was a warmth in her voice that Mason genuinely leaned on sometimes, without always acknowledging it. "He's good, Mason. Go do your work." "I might be back tomorrow instead of today. I figured. I know, go." He called Eli next. Eli answered with his mouth full of something, which meant it was cereal, and said, "Dad, I'm reading," which Mason took as a sign of health and normalcy and accepted it without complaint. "I love you," Mason said. "Love you too." Brooklyn Bridge is really cool, by the way. They used compressed air chambers for the foundations, which is actually kind of terrifying when you think about it. "I'll think about that," Mason said. He hung up and looked at the ceiling of his hotel room, which was the same hotel ceiling beige as every other hotel ceiling he'd ever stared at, and thought about the fact that his son thought compressed air chambers were kind of terrifying and also cool. Eli was going to be fine. Eli was already fine. Mason got up and went to the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. He had 5 hours to figure out how to tell a 30-year-old CEO that her company was sicker than she realized, that the people around her might have been managing the truth, and that the only way to fix it was to tear down the system that had been making everyone's numbers look good. He turned on the shower. The Ashford Logistics headquarters was in Midtown, which meant it was the kind of building that was trying to communicate something about permanence and authority through glass and steel and a lobby that was larger than it strictly needed to be. Mason arrived 11 minutes early, which was his baseline. He was never late, but he also wasn't the kind of early that made other people feel watched. The receptionist called up, sent him through security, gave him a visitor badge that he clipped to his lapel, and would definitely forget to return. The elevator opened on the 31st floor. The executive suite was large in the specific way of companies that had grown faster than their culture, spaces that were designed to impress clients rather than function for the people who worked in them. A lot of glass, a lot of space between furniture, the kind of place where sound traveled. Victoria was already in the conference room. She looked different in her own environment. Still tired, he didn't think that had changed since the flight, but more armored. Posture precise. The blazer was a different one, darker, and there was a woman next to her who was introduced as Diane, her chief of staff, and 2 men in suits who were introduced as senior executives and whose names Mason immediately forgot because he was already looking at the wall of data displays behind them. "I took the liberty," Victoria said, "of pulling some of the performance reports from the last 4 quarters." She was watching him. Not the way people watch a consultant they've hired to tell them what they already know. The way people watch someone who said something on a late-night flight that they haven't been able to stop thinking about. Mason looked at the reports. He looked at them for a long moment. "These are the summary reports," he said. "Yes." "Can I see the underlying data?" A small pause. "Which data specifically?" "Raw completion rates. By route? By freight category? Break it out by time-sensitive versus standard." He looked at her. "If you have it." "We have it." "Then yes, that." The executive to Victoria's right, his name might have been Phillips, shifted slightly in his chair. Mason noticed but didn't comment. "It'll take a few minutes to pull," Victoria said. She looked at Diane. "Can you get operations on the line?" It took 4 minutes. The underlying data appeared on the screen at one end of the conference room, and Mason spent 30 seconds looking at it before he understood that what he'd suspected from the outside was substantially worse from the inside. He pulled out his notebook. Old habit. He trusted his own handwriting more than typed notes in rooms where he didn't know who was watching. "Your medical contract completion rates," he said. "Yes," said the executive, who might be Phillips. "You'll see they're consistent with industry benchmarks." "I'm looking at raw data," Mason said, "not adjusted for claimed extenuating circumstances." He turned to Victoria. "Your medical freight, anything with temperature sensitivity or expiration windows, is completing at 63% on time over the last 6 months." Silence. The benchmark numbers in your summary reports are 81%, Mason said. That's because the calculation methodology includes a category of routes classified as impacted by external conditions, which gets excluded from the performance denominator. He looked at Phillips. That's not industry standard. That's a custom classification. Phillips opened his mouth. Don't, Victoria said quietly. Not angrily, just definitely. Phillips closed his mouth. Victoria was looking at the screen. Her face was doing something complicated. The expression of someone who is receiving information they suspected and still isn't ready for. 63%, she said, on your medical contracts. Mason kept his voice even. This was the part of the job he liked least. Not the discovery, but the delivery. Which means roughly 1 in 3 time-sensitive medical shipments is failing to arrive on time. That's not, Philip started. Richard. Victoria's voice was sharper now. So his name was Richard. Let him finish. Mason looked at Richard Phillips and saw a man who had been very comfortable for a very long time. The specific set of a jaw when someone has spent months assuring a CEO that the numbers are fine. The routing system, Mason said, turning back to Victoria, is optimized for cost. Lowest carrier cost, most efficient load, minimum deadhead miles. It's a well-designed system for moving standard freight, but time-sensitive medical product doesn't behave like standard freight. When you optimize for cost, you end up routing medical shipments through the high-volume, high-transfer nodes, which are also the highest failure nodes. More handoffs, more opportunities for delay. He paused. Has anyone looked at which routes the medical failures are concentrated on? Not specifically, Victoria said. I'd like to look. They gave him an office. A real one, with a door, which he suspected was more than most visiting consultants got, and which probably communicated something about how seriously Victoria was taking this. He spent 2 hours in there with the data. At one point, a young analyst named Carlos knocked and asked if he needed anything. Mason asked for more data, specifically route logs from the last 18 months, cross-referenced with freight category. Carlos looked slightly alarmed by the specificity of the request, but disappeared and came back 20 minutes later with a thumb drive and an expression that suggested he'd had to have a conversation with someone to get it. Mason didn't ask who that someone was, not yet. He worked through the data the way he always worked, slowly at first, building the map in his head, then faster as the pattern emerged. It was like adjusting focus on a lens, blurry at first, then clearer, then suddenly very clear indeed. The medical freight failures weren't random. They were concentrated on 17 specific routes, and those 17 routes had something in common. They all passed through 4 transfer hubs that processed the highest volume of standard freight. The hubs were perpetually overloaded. And when a hub was overloaded and had to make triage decisions about which freight got priority treatment, the answer was almost always the freight with the highest value penalties for delay. Medical freight had lower financial penalties than, say, retail product with strict SLA contracts. So the medical freight kept getting deprioritized. Not through any deliberate decision, just through the logic of a system that had been built to protect against financial penalty and hadn't thought about the other kind of cost. Mason sat back in his chair and stared at his notes. He thought about the insulin in Cincinnati, the 19 hours. He thought about the fact that this system had been running for, he checked the date stamps on the route data, at least 14 months. He wrote in his notebook, they knew. Then he crossed it out. Then he wrote, someone knew. Because that was more honest. An entire organization couldn't know something and keep it perfectly contained. But someone with access to this data, someone who could read a route completion log, had to have seen this pattern. It wasn't subtle once you looked. He stood up and went to find Victoria. She was in her office, which was off the main executive suite and had windows that looked north toward Central Park. She was on the phone when he knocked, and she held up one finger without looking at him. He waited. She wrapped up the call with the focused efficiency of someone who spends most of their life on phone calls and has gotten very good at ending them. Put the phone down. Looked at him. Tell me, she said. He closed the door. He told her. He laid out the whole picture, the routing logic, the transfer hub concentrations, the triage deprioritization, The custom classification system that was making the numbers look better than they were. He did it clearly and without softening the edges, because he'd found that people in Victoria Ashford's position didn't actually benefit from softened edges. They needed to see the shape of the problem. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the office was quiet. 14 months, she said. At least. I've been CEO for 18 months. He didn't say anything. So this started before me, she said. The routing system predates your tenure, yes, but the performance data has been available throughout. She looked at the window. Someone has been seeing this data. Someone with access to route completion logs, yes, and deciding not to bring it to my attention. I can't tell you the decision-making that happened. I can tell you what the data shows. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Richard Phillips oversees operations. I noticed. She looked back at him. How bad is the client exposure? That I don't know yet. I'd need to look at the contract terms. I can tell you. She stood up, crossed to her desk, picked up a file that was already there, which told Mason she'd been anticipating this question before he walked in. Our largest healthcare client is NovaCare Health Systems. They represent 38% of our medical contract revenue. She didn't open the file. They have a quarterly performance review in 11 days. If our reliability numbers don't meet threshold, she stopped. What's the threshold? 75% on time for temperature-sensitive freight. Mason thought about the 63% in the data. That's a problem, he said. That's a problem, Victoria agreed. She sat back down, looked at him with the direct, flat attention he was coming to understand was just how she looked when she was thinking hard. What would you do? He thought about whether to answer that. He thought about the fact that he had a flight at 2, and a kid reading about Brooklyn Bridge foundations in Chicago, and a report on someone else's problems that he hadn't finished yet. He thought about 63%. He thought about the insulin. I'd want to know, he said, who in your organization has been looking at these numbers? She nodded slowly. Because fixing the routing system is the technical problem, Mason said, and I think the technical problem is solvable. But the reason you're sitting here finding out about this from a stranger you met on a plane, he stopped. That's a different kind of problem. Victoria Ashford was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Will you stay? He thought about Eli. He thought about Mrs. Kowalski, who had said, I figured this morning with the particular patience of someone who had stopped being surprised by Mason's work, calling him sideways. He thought about 17 routes and 14 months and 1 in 3. I need to make a call, he said. She nodded. He went back to the borrowed office and called Mrs. Kowalski. He's fine, she said, before he could ask. He's drawing diagrams of suspension cables. I might need another couple of days. I know. I'll owe you. You always do. He could hear her smiling. Go fix whatever's broken, Mason. He hung up. He sat for a moment in the quiet office, 31 floors above Midtown Manhattan, with the data on the screen in front of him. He thought about the last thing he'd written in his notebook. Someone knew. He looked at the report in his hands. He looked at the circled name. He thought about the question he hadn't asked yet, the question underneath the question. And he knew, with the specific certainty that came from years of sitting in rooms full of other people's problems, that the answer to that question was going to be harder than the routing data. He went back to Victoria's office. I'll stay, he said. She looked at him across the desk. I should tell you, I don't know exactly where this goes, what we find, what it means. Neither do I. You're comfortable with that? He thought about it honestly. No, he said, but I'll stay anyway. Something crossed her face, not relief exactly, more like the quiet recognition of someone who has been waiting for someone to say a true thing. All right, she said. Then let's start. The borrowed office on the 31st floor had a window that faced east, which meant that by early afternoon the sun came through at an angle that turned the data on the screen into something that was hard to read without squinting. Mason didn't fix it. He'd learned a long time ago that minor discomforts kept him from getting too comfortable, and comfortable was not something he could afford to be right now. He'd called the Chicago firm that had originally hired him, a smaller consulting outfit called Meridian Analytics, and told them he needed to extend his availability by several days. His contact there, a man named Greg Holt, who communicated primarily through single-sentence emails and occasional sighs, said client situation, and Mason said something like that, and Greg said, send me an update by Friday, and that was that. Independent consulting had its complications, but its freedoms were real. Victoria had arranged for Carlos to be his primary data contact. Carlos Reyes, 26, junior operations analyst, who had the particular energy of someone who was very good at his job and had spent some time wondering if anyone was going to notice. Mason noticed within about 4 minutes of their first real conversation, which happened around 11 in the morning when Carlos knocked and came in with a second thumb drive and an expression that was harder to read than the first time. I had to go through 2 managers to get the rote logs, Carlos said, setting the drive on the desk. Which managers? First was Sandra in data compliance. That was fine. She just needed authorization from upstairs. He paused. Second was Phillips. Mason looked at the drive. Phillips authorized it? He didn't authorize it exactly. He said he'd need to review the request. Carlos's voice had the careful flatness of someone reporting a fact they don't want to editorialize. Ms. Ashford's office called down and moved it through. How long did that take? About 40 minutes. Mason picked up the drive. What would the normal turnaround be on a data request like this? Carlos looked at him. 10 minutes. Maybe 15 if Sandra's busy. Mason didn't say anything. He plugged in the drive. Mr. Reed, Carlos said. Mason. Mason. The kid paused. There's something else. He said it in a particular way. Not dramatic, not like someone building to a revelation. More like someone who had been holding something for a while and had finally found a place to set it down. Mason looked up from the screen. I wrote a report, Carlos said, last spring, March, April, about the medical routing failures. I ran the numbers on the completion rates after I noticed the pattern in the Q1 data. He crossed his arms, which was a self-containing gesture more than a defensive one. I submitted it through the standard reporting channel, Internal Ops Review. What happened to it? I got an email back from Phillips saying the findings were being incorporated into an operational review and that I should direct any follow-up questions through his office. He looked at the window. That was 14 months ago. The office was quiet. Did you follow up? Mason asked. Twice. Got the same response both times, just different wording. He looked back at Mason. Then in August, I sent a note directly to Ms. Ashford's office. I knew it might not be a good idea politically, but the numbers weren't getting better. What happened? Her assistant replied. Said the matter was being reviewed by senior operations leadership and would be addressed in the standard reporting cycle. Carlos's jaw tightened slightly. I don't think she ever saw it. Mason sat with that for a moment. Do you still have the report? He said. I have every version of it. I updated it every month. I'd like to see all of them. Carlos nodded. He'd expected this, Mason could tell. He'd probably been hoping someone would ask for exactly this, for a long time. I'll send them to the secure share folder Ms. Ashford's office set up for you. Thank you, Carlos. The analyst started for the door, then stopped. The October version is the most complete. I added route-specific failure breakdowns after I got access to the hub data. He didn't turn around. I wasn't supposed to have that access. I requested it through the system and nobody rejected the request, so I used it. I won't ask how, Mason said. Good. Carlos left. Mason looked at the screen, then at his notebook where he'd written and crossed out and rewritten someone new. He drew a circle around it. Then he wrote underneath, Carlos Reyes, March 14 months ago, and then, below that, Phillips. He leaned back in the chair. The sun was still coming through the east window at the wrong angle. He squinted at the screen and didn't fix it, and started reading Carlos's reports from the beginning. They were good. Genuinely, carefully good. The work of someone who understood data and had taken time with the analysis and had written conclusions that were specific without being inflammatory. The March report identified the pattern of medical freight failures, cross-referenced it with hub volume data, and concluded with a recommendation to commission a full routing review with particular attention to time-sensitive freight categories. It was exactly the right recommendation. It was 14 months old. Mason read through April, May, June. Each version updated the numbers, refined the analysis, added detail. By August, Carlos had identified the specific 17 routes and the 4 overloaded transfer hubs. He'd quantified the gap between reported performance and actual performance. He'd noted, carefully, that the reporting methodology appeared to include a classification category that wasn't consistent with industry standard measurement. He'd been seeing exactly what Mason was seeing 11 months earlier from inside the organization, and nobody had done anything. Mason set the reports aside and stared at the ceiling for a moment. This was the second thing now. The routing problem was the technical problem. The suppressed reports were the other thing, the harder thing, the problem underneath the problem. He'd known it was there when he asked the question in Victoria's office, but knowing something is there and finding it documented in 14 months of updated analysis reports were different weights entirely. He picked up his phone and texted Victoria. "Need to meet. Today if possible." "I found something." Her reply came back in under 2 minutes. "Conference room B, 4 o'clock. He looked at his watch. He had 3 hours. He spent them reading. By the time he walked into conference room B at 4 o'clock, he had a clear picture. Not complete. There were still things he didn't know, things he'd need to verify, gaps in the chain he couldn't fill from data alone. But clear enough. Victoria was alone this time. No Diane, no Phillips, no suits whose names he'd already forgotten. She was standing at the window with a cup of coffee that was probably not cold yet, looking out at the mid-afternoon traffic on 6th Avenue, and she turned when he came in. She looked at him for a second. "That's a face," she said. "Is it? You have the look of someone who found something worse than they expected." He set his notebook on the conference table. "Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her. He opened the notebook to the page where he'd been writing all afternoon and laid it flat between them. "Your analyst, Carlos Reyes, submitted an internal report identifying the medical routing failures in March of last year," Mason said. "He updated it monthly for the following 11 months. He submitted it through official channels twice and attempted to reach your office directly once." He looked at her. "Phillips intercepted every one of them." Victoria's expression didn't change exactly, but something in her went very still. "The report Phillips said was being incorporated into an operational review," Mason continued, "was never incorporated into anything. I've been through the operational review records for the last 4 quarters. Carlos's findings are not referenced anywhere in any official document." "He buried them," Victoria said. Flat. Not a question. He ignored them, reclassified them, or redirected them. The specific mechanism is harder to establish from the data, but the effect is the same. Mason paused. "He's not the only one. I cross-referenced the reporting logs. There are at least 2 other instances where frontline employees flagged reliability issues in the medical routes. One from a coordinator at the Dallas hub in July, one from a driver supervisor in the Northeast Corridor in September. Both went through Phillips's division. Neither appears in any formal review." Victoria was quiet. "How well do you know him?" Mason asked. "I've known him since I was 12. He started with my father in the early days." She said it without any particular warmth, just a fact. "He's been head of operations for 9 years. 9 years is a long time to run a system. And to believe that you understand it better than anyone else." She set her coffee cup down. "And to stop hearing things you don't want to hear." Mason had been in enough organizations to know that this was probably true, that it wasn't necessarily malice at the root of it. It was the calculus of a person who had built something they believed in, who had watched it get more complicated than they'd planned for, and who had started making decisions about what information was useful and what information was just noise. It happened slowly, usually. A report here, a concern there, each individual decision feeling reasonable in the moment. Until 14 months had passed and 63% was 63%, and the insulin was sitting at room temperature in Cincinnati. "I'm not telling you what to do with this," Mason said. "I know. What I'm telling you is that the technical problem and the organizational problem are connected. You can rebuild the routing system, but if the people running it are still selecting what information reaches leadership, then you'll be back here in 18 months looking at different numbers with the same shape." She stood up, walked to the window. He watched her stand there for a moment, looking out at the street. Novacare, she said. 11 days. If they terminate the contract, she stopped. It won't just be Novacare, it'll signal the whole medical sector. We have 4 other healthcare contracts. 2 of them come up for renewal in the first quarter. She turned back to him. The combined revenue exposure is close to $800 million. Mason had run the numbers on his own estimate. $800 million was roughly what he'd come to, too. And that's just direct contract revenue, Victoria added. The reputational cascade? She shook her head. My father built this company on the medical contracts. They were the ones he was most proud of. He talked about them like they were... She stopped again. He said they were the ones that mattered because the consequences were real. You couldn't hide behind the numbers because someone was waiting on a medication. The room was quiet for a moment. He was right, Mason said. Victoria looked at him. He died not knowing the system had drifted this far. He didn't know the right thing to say to that, so he didn't say anything. She came back to the table, sat down, looked at his notebook. What do you need? Direct access to the operations data systems, not through Phillips's chain. Done. The ability to talk directly to frontline employees without going through management layers. Coordinators, hub supervisors, drivers if necessary. Done. And I need to know, says, before I dig any further, what you're prepared to do with what I find. He said it directly, because he'd been in situations before where the answer to that question had changed the value of the finding. Because some of what I find might require decisions you don't want to make. Victoria looked at him steadily. I'm aware of that. I need to know you're aware of it. Richard Phillips has been with this company for 9 years, she said. He knew my father. He was at my father's funeral. She paused. And he has been systematically preventing critical operational information from reaching me for at least 14 months, while our medical freight performance was failing in ways that could have cost people their lives. She picked up her coffee. Yes, Mason, I'm aware of what finding the rest of this might require. He closed his notebook. Then I need a few more days. You have them. He called Mrs. Kowalski that evening from his hotel, and she said Eli was fine before he'd finished saying hello. He asked to talk to Eli. Eli was in the middle of something, but came to the phone anyway and told Mason that the Brooklyn Bridge had taken 14 years to build and that 2 people died in a caisson accident in 1872, and that the chief engineer's wife basically supervised the final construction because her husband was sick, and Mason said, "That's remarkable," and meant it. Are you okay? Eli asked, in the way 11-year-olds ask when they've picked up on something their parent hasn't said. I'm good. I'm working on something. Something broken? Yeah. Are you fixing it? Working on it. Eli was quiet for a second. Okay, he said. Good. And then, like he'd completed the transaction, I'm going back to my book. I love you. You too. Click. Mason sat on the edge of the hotel bed with his phone in his hand and thought about Eli asking, "Are you fixing it?" with the simple confidence that fixing it was what happened next. He thought about Carlos Reyes, 26, submitting the same report every month for 14 months and getting variations of the same non-answer back. He thought about Richard Phillips, who had known Victoria since she was 12. He ordered room service and kept working. The next 3 days had a specific texture that Mason would remember later, not as a sequence of events, but as a kind of sustained pressure. The feeling of a thing coming into focus that you're not sure you want to see clearly. He started at the Dallas hub. Not physically, he couldn't go to Dallas, not in the time they had, but he got the hub supervisor on a call, a woman named Anita Garza, who'd been managing the Dallas distribution center for 6 years, and who started the call with the specific wariness of someone who has spoken to people from corporate before and learned not to expect much from it. Ms. Ashford's office set up this call, Mason said. I'm a consultant. I'm looking at the medical routing failures in your hub's data. I want to understand what's happening from your end, not from the reports. A pause. From my end? What do you see on the floor that doesn't show up in the numbers? Another pause. Longer. He could hear her deciding. Medical freight comes through us on 3 of the routes in your analysis, she said finally. The volume's been going up for 2 years. Our sorting capacity hasn't scaled with it. She was talking carefully, like she was feeling the ground for ice. When we hit peak volume, which we hit basically every other week now, we have to make triage decisions. Which freight moves first? And medical freight doesn't move first. Medical freight has the lowest penalty weight in the system. The wariness in her voice was shifting into something more tired, which means when I've got temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals sitting on the dock and I've got a retail pallet with a $40,000 SLA penalty, the system tells my coordinators to move the retail first. Has this been reported? She laughed. It was a short, humorless sound. I wrote a report in July. What happened to it? Got a call from someone in Phillips's office. Very pleasant. Told me the capacity issue was being evaluated as part of a longer-term infrastructure review and that I should continue to operate within current system protocols. She paused. I asked what I was supposed to do when current system protocols meant medical freight sat on the dock for 4 hours. She said that was what the extenuating circumstances classification was for. Mason wrote that down. Extenuating circumstances classification. That's how it gets pulled out of the performance denominator. You classify the delay as operationally caused by hub capacity constraints, which gets tagged as an extenuating circumstance, which doesn't count against the completion rate. Her voice was flat now. I didn't design that system. I was told to use it. Did you understand what it was for? A pause. I understood it was a way to make the numbers look better than they were. She said it the way people say things they've been carrying. I'm not proud of that. But I didn't have a lot of options when Phillips's office was calling and the system was telling me what classification to use. I understand, Mason said. Does Ms. Ashford know about this? She's learning about it now. Silence on the line. Then, is she going to fix it, or is she going to send somebody else down to tell me to keep using the extenuating circumstances tag? I think she's going to fix it, Mason said. But I can't promise you that. Fair enough. Another pause. For what it's worth, my July report had a solution in it. 2 additional sort lines and a priority protocol for temperature-sensitive freight that would have cost about $800,000 to implement. I ran the numbers. The cost of the contract losses we've taken since then is probably 4 times that. I'll make sure that's in front of her. Thank you. She said it in a way that meant it. The Northeast Corridor supervisor was a man named Dave Okafor, who'd been driving routes for 8 years before moving to supervision, which meant he knew the operational reality better than anyone who'd spent their career in offices. He said almost the same thing Anita Garza had said, in different words, with the same tired edge underneath. We raised it in September, he said. I had a driver, 20-year veteran, never filed a complaint in his life, come to me and say the routing was making him choose between following the system and getting the medical product where it needed to go on time. Like, physically, the route wouldn't allow both. He'd have to deviate from the assigned route to hit the medical stop on time, and that deviation would trigger a system flag. Dave's voice had the controlled frustration of someone who'd been through this. I wrote it up, sent it through the standard channel. You know what I got back? Phillips. Someone from his office, yes. He paused. They sent me a revised routing protocol that added 15 minutes to the medical delivery window. Made it look like they were responding. He stopped. They added 15 minutes to how late the delivery could be before it was counted as late. They didn't actually fix the route. Mason stopped writing for a second. They moved the goalpost, he said. That's what they did. He told Victoria all of it that evening. He laid it out in order. Carlos's reports, Anita Garza, Dave Okafor, the extenuating circumstances classification system, the widened delivery windows. He didn't editorialize. He just laid it down, piece by piece, on the conference table between them. When he finished, Victoria was quiet for a long time. This is a system, she said. Not one bad decision. A system. Yes. He built a system to manage what information I received. Mason didn't say anything. For how long? The extenuating circumstances classification was introduced 22 months ago, before your tenure as CEO. He let that land. It's possible it started as a legitimate reporting adjustment and evolved. It's possible it was designed this way from the beginning. I can't tell you which from the data. But the reports from Carlos, from Anita, from Dave, those were all after I took over. Yes. which means the decisions about redirecting those reports were made after I was in the building. Her voice was quiet and very steady, which he'd come to understand meant she was angrier than she looked. He looked at me every week in executive meetings and talked about operational performance, and he knew. It looks that way. It looks that way, she repeated. You're being careful. I'm being accurate. There may be things I'm not seeing, but what I can see, yes, he knew. She stood up, walked to the window. The Manhattan skyline was going dark blue in the late evening, lights beginning to come on in the buildings across the street. She stood there for a while without saying anything. Then, I have to fire him. That's your decision. I know it's my decision. She turned. I'm not asking for permission. I'm saying it out loud. She looked at him. He's going to fight it. His lawyer will say the reports were being reviewed, that the classification system was operationally justified, that there's no direct line between his decisions and the contract failures. That's probably true. So what do I do? You tell the truth about what the data shows, and you let the lawyers sort out what's legally actionable and what's not. He looked at her steadily. The firing isn't about what you can prove in court. It's about whether you can run this company with someone in that role who has demonstrated that he selects what information reaches you. She was quiet. You can't, Mason said. That's my read, for what it's worth. It's worth something. She came back to the table, sat down. She looked, for the first time since he'd met her, genuinely tired in a way she wasn't trying to manage. My father trusted him. I know. That's not an excuse. I know that's not an excuse. She rubbed the side of her face. It just... She stopped. Makes it harder, Mason said. Yeah. She looked at the table. Yeah, it does. They sat there for a moment, the two of them in the conference room with the data on the table between them, and the city going quietly dark outside. 11 days, Mason said. NovaCare. She nodded slowly. I need a plan. I have one. Partly. She looked up. Tell me. He opened his notebook. The routing system can be restructured. Not rebuilt entirely from scratch. You don't have time for that. But the medical freight routing can be separated from the standard freight optimization model and run on a reliability-first protocol. The 17 problem routes get rerouted through the lower volume hubs, which have better completion rates. The 4 overloaded hubs get medical freight removed from their intake until the capacity issue is addressed. He paused. Anita Garza's $800,000 solution is probably the right starting point for the capacity fix. Victoria was listening. The extenuating circumstances classification system gets suspended immediately. All medical freight delays get reported against actual performance. He met her eyes. Your numbers are going to get worse before they get better. The next 2 weeks of reported performance is going to look bad. I know. I'm telling you because you need to be ready for that conversation with NovaCare. I know, she said again. I'm not going to walk into that meeting with better-looking lies. I'm going to walk in with a real plan and honest numbers. She said it with a firmness that he believed. What else? You need direct reporting channels from the hub supervisors, something that doesn't go through operations management. Anita Garza and Dave Okafor need to be able to send their actual findings to someone who's going to read them. To me, you mean. That, or someone you designate who you trust. But yes, the information needs to reach the level where decisions get made without getting filtered through the people who have reasons to filter it. He paused. That's not a criticism of any particular executive. It's a structural problem. Layers of management will always create opportunities for information to get shaped. The question is whether you build in counterweights. Victoria was nodding slowly. Carlos Reyes. He's one of them. There are probably others. He was right for 14 months and nobody listened to him. She said it like she was tasting it. How old is he? 26. She looked at the table. 26. She was quiet for a moment. What does he know about operations beyond the data? I haven't asked him that yet. Ask him. She paused. I want to know what he sees when he looks at the whole picture, not just the numbers. Mason made a note. I'll talk to him tomorrow. Good. She straightened slightly, something resolved in her face. Not the tiredness going away, but some kind of decision getting made on the other side of it. I'm meeting with Richard tomorrow morning. I want him out of the building by noon. Are you doing that alone? Legal will be there, HR. She looked at him. Do you want to be there? He thought about it. No, that's an internal thing. My being there doesn't help you. He paused. But tell me what he says. Why? Because how he responds to being confronted might tell us what else there is to find. She looked at him for a moment. You think there's more? I think 14 months of managed information is a long time, and I think a person who builds a system that careful doesn't usually do it for one reason. Victoria was quiet. It might be nothing beyond what we already know, Mason said, but I'd want to know how he reacts. She nodded. I'll tell you. He gathered his notebook and stood. He was tired in the bone-deep way that came from sustained thinking about difficult things, and he had another full day tomorrow before he'd even get to the conversation with Carlos. And somewhere in Chicago, his son was probably asleep with a book about bridges open on his chest. He was almost to the conference room door when Victoria said, Mason. He turned. She was still at the table, her hands around the coffee cup, looking at him with an expression that was harder to read than her professional face. More open somehow, less managed. Thank you, she said, for staying. He thought about the first time she'd asked, and about how he'd almost said no, and about the 63%, and the insulin and Carlos submitting his report every month into a silence that told him nothing useful. Yeah, he said. Get some sleep. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. You too. He went back to the hotel. He lay in the dark and thought about what Phillips would say tomorrow morning when Victoria walked into that meeting. He thought about the specific mathematics of a person who has spent 9 years in the same role, finding out that the person across the desk knows what they did. He thought about what the next 11 days were going to look like. The routing restructure, the hub conversations, the NovaCare meeting, all of it stacked on top of each other like cards in a configuration that required very careful handling. He thought about Eli asking, "Are you fixing it?" with such calm certainty that of course you were. He was trying. He didn't know yet if trying was going to be enough. He closed his eyes, and this time, without a report sliding off his lap or a stranger's shoulder to drift toward, he actually fell asleep. The meeting with Phillips happened at 8:30 in the morning, which Mason knew because Victoria texted him at 8:27. Going in now. He was already at his desk on 31 with a coffee he'd picked up from the cart in the lobby. $3, paper cup, the kind of coffee that was exactly what it claimed to be and nothing more, and the route restructuring plan open on his laptop. He'd been working since 6, not because he'd planned to, but because he'd woken up at 5:50 with the specific alertness that came when his brain had been processing something overnight and had arrived at a conclusion it wanted to report. The conclusion was this: the routing restructure was only going to hold if the hub supervisors understood why it was changing, not just the new protocols, the reason. Because Anita Garza and Dave Okafor had been operating inside a system that told them one thing while the reality on their floors told them another, and if someone just sent down a new set of protocols without explaining that the information they'd been sending up had finally reached someone who read it, then the new system would eventually drift the same way the old one had. People followed rules they understood. They found ways around rules that felt arbitrary. Mason was writing this up when the text came. He set his coffee down and waited. At 9:17, Victoria texted again. Come up. He took the stairs. Old habit. Stairs gave him a few seconds to think before he had to be in the room. Victoria's office had a different quality to it than the evening before. The morning light was different, harder, and she was standing near her desk rather than sitting, which was something he'd noticed she did when she was managing a significant amount of internal energy. Diane was there in the chair near the door, with a legal pad on her knee that had writing on it. He denied it, Victoria said, before Mason had fully closed the door. Which part? All of it. He said Carlos's report had been incorporated into the Q2 operational review, which it wasn't, we checked, and that the hub reports were being monitored through standard channels. She paused. He said the extenuating circumstances classification was an industry-accepted methodology, and that I was being given inaccurate information by an outside consultant who didn't understand the company's reporting framework. Mason looked at Diane. Diane looked back at him with the expression of someone who had been taking notes and had no intention of inserting herself into this. "What did legal say?" Mason asked. "They advised caution. Specifically, they said terminating him for cause requires documented evidence of willful misconduct, which is harder to establish than—" Victoria stopped. Their word was negligence. They said what we have right now looks more like negligence than willful misconduct. "He built a classification system to pull failures out of the performance denominator," Mason said. "That's not negligence." "I know that." "Does legal know the details of how the system works?" Victoria glanced at Diane. Diane said, "They've been briefed on the high level, not the specifics of the extenuating circumstances methodology." "Walk them through it," Mason said. "All of it. The classification criteria, the timing of when it was introduced, the correlation between the classification usage and the performance numbers." He looked at Victoria. "If they see the full picture, their read on willful versus negligent might change." Victoria nodded slowly. "Then, he's still in the building." "You didn't suspend him?" "Legal advised against it pending review." She said it with the specific restraint of someone who disagreed with the advice and was following it anyway. "He's in his office, which means he has access to the operations data systems for however long this takes." Mason understood the implication immediately. How much can he alter from his access level? "Route classifications, hub priority settings, the extenuating circumstances tagging system." Diane was reading from her legal pad now. "Standard reporting configurations." "Can you cut his system access without it being considered a suspension?" Diane wrote something. "I'll find out." "Today," Victoria said. "Find out today." She looked at Mason. "What do you need?" "I need to talk to Carlos. I need to get the routing restructure proposal in front of your operations team, the people below Phillips, the actual route managers, and I need to know if there's anyone else in the management layer who's been actively involved in shaping the reporting." "You think Phillips had help?" "I think a system that elaborate is hard to maintain alone." He said it carefully. "I don't know that, but I'd want to know who was in his reporting chain and who had access to the classification system and how it was used." Victoria looked at the window. Something moved across her face, something tired and complicated that she didn't try to hide. "My father's company," she said quietly. Not to Mason specifically, more to the room. He didn't say anything. She turned back. "All right, I'll set up a meeting with the route managers for this afternoon. Carlos is yours. Use him however you need." She paused. "And Mason, when you talk to the team this afternoon, you're not announcing anything about Phillips. We haven't officially made any decision about his status." "Understood. But they need to understand that what they tell you is going to be used, that this isn't another review that disappears." "I'll make that clear." He went back to his office and called Carlos. Carlos arrived in 4 minutes, which suggested he'd already been at his desk for a while. He came in and sat in the chair across from Mason and waited, and Mason thought again about what kind of person spent 14 months submitting the same updated report into silence and kept doing it anyway. "The route manager's meeting is this afternoon," Mason said. "I want you there." Carlos looked surprised. Not the kind of surprise that was performing surprise, Joe. Actual surprise. "Me? You know this data better than I do. I've had it for 4 days. You've had it for 14 months. Mason looked at him directly. "You're going to walk through the findings with me. I'll handle the restructuring proposal. You handle the data." Carlos was quiet for a moment. "Phillips is still in the building." "He is." "He's not going to like that." "No," Mason agreed. "He's not." Another pause. "Okay," Carlos said, like it was simple, like it was just a decision, and then you made it. "Tell me something," Mason said. "When you sent the last report, November, the most recent one, what did you think was going to happen?" Carlos looked at the window, thought about it genuinely, which Mason appreciated. "Honestly, I didn't know anymore. I kept updating it because the data kept changing, and I thought, if it ever reaches someone, I want them to have the most current version." He paused. "I almost stopped in August, after the call from Phillips's office about the widened delivery windows." He looked back at Mason. But I thought about what the freight was. Medical product. If it were like furniture in those routes, I probably would have stopped. Mason nodded. Is Ms. Ashford going to be at the meeting this afternoon? Carlos asked. No, she's dealing with other things today. Good. At Mason's look, Carlos added, I mean, not good. Just, I think the route managers will talk more freely if she's not in the room. That was probably right. Mason made a note of it. The route managers' meeting was at 2 o'clock in conference room A, which was larger than conference room B and had a projector that Carlos had spent 20 minutes testing and adjusting beforehand with the focused care of someone for whom presentation technology was a known enemy. There were 7 people in the room, regional route managers, 2 hub operations leads, and a woman named Joyce Chen, who managed the systems integration between the routing software and the carrier dispatch platform. They filed in with the specific energy of people who'd been called to a meeting by the CEO's office and didn't fully know why, which was a mixture of wariness and a particular kind of hope that Mason had learned to recognize, the hope that this might be the meeting where something actually happened. Mason introduced himself. He didn't oversell it. I'm a consultant. I've been looking at the medical routing failures and the performance data. I want to understand what you're seeing from your end, and I want to talk through a proposed restructuring. He looked around the table. I need you to be straight with me. I know that might be a different dynamic than what you're used to, but what you say in this room is going to inform the plan, and the plan is going to go to Miss Ashford directly. So it matters. A man named Frank DeLuca, who managed the Northeast routes, shifted in his chair. He was in his mid-50s and had the look of someone who'd seen a lot of meetings and a lot of consultants and had stopped expecting either to produce much. Who else sees what we say? Ms. Ashford and her chief of staff. Legal may review notes. No one in the operations management chain above your level has access to this room's conversation. Frank looked at the man next to him, another route manager, younger, who Mason hadn't been introduced to yet. Something passed between them. Then I'll start, Frank said, because I've been wanting to say this for 8 months and nobody's asked. What followed was 2 hours that Mason spent mostly listening. Frank DeLuca had been managing the Northeast Corridor routes for 11 years. He said the medical freight problems had started, from his perspective, about 2 years ago, when the routing software was updated with a new optimization algorithm that the company had licensed from a tech vendor. The algorithm was better at minimizing costs than the old system. It was significantly worse at accounting for hub capacity variables. It treats all hubs like they have infinite throughput, Frank said, which they don't. The Dallas hub, the Memphis hub, the Newark hub, all of them hit capacity ceilings regularly. The algorithm doesn't know that. It just keeps routing to them because they're on the cheapest paths. Was this raised when the algorithm was introduced? Mason asked. I raised it in the implementation meeting. Frank's jaw was set. I said the optimization model needed to be tested against actual hub capacity data before it went live. I was told the vendor had done stress testing and the system was ready. He paused. The vendor's stress testing used theoretical hub capacities, not actual ones. Joyce Chen, the systems integration manager, leaned forward. I have the implementation documentation. The capacity parameters in the vendor's test environment were set at 120% of our actual documented capacities. She said it with the precision of someone who'd looked at this and been bothered by it for a long time. So the system was tested under conditions that don't exist. Who made the decision to go live with the algorithm? Mason asked. The room was quiet for a second. Frank said, Philip signed off on it. Mason wrote it down. One of the other managers, the younger one next to Frank, whose name was Ray Gutierrez, talked about the priority protocol. He managed the southern routes, and his description of the triage logic in the hub system matched exactly what Anita Garza had told Mason on the phone. When a hub hit capacity and had to choose which freight moved first, the system used a penalty weight calculation. Medical freight was consistently low penalty because the healthcare contracts had been written. Ray used the word negotiated with a particular tone, with lower financial SLA penalties than the retail and commercial contracts. Why were the healthcare contracts negotiated that way? Mason asked. Ray looked at the table. I don't know the full history. But the story I've heard is that when the healthcare contracts were renegotiated 3 years ago, the company went in with lower penalties as a selling point to win the business. The pitch was, we're confident in our reliability, so we're not going to burden you with heavy penalty clauses. Mason sat with that for a second. So the company voluntarily accepted lower financial penalties on the healthcare contracts to win them. Right. And then the routing system, which uses financial penalty weight to prioritize freight, deprioritized the healthcare freight because it had the lowest penalties. Right. So the structure that was supposed to win the healthcare business became the structure that caused the healthcare business to fail. Ray looked at him. That's a very clear way to put it. Did anyone trace that connection? The room was quiet again. Frank said, if they did, it didn't go anywhere. Carlos presented his 14 months of data without flinching. Mason watched the route managers' faces while Carlos walked through it. The completion rates, the hub concentration, the failure pattern, the widened delivery windows. Most of them had the look of people seeing their own observations confirmed in aggregate for the first time. Frank DeLuca watched the screen with an expression that was somewhere between grim satisfaction and exhaustion. When Carlos finished, Joyce Chen said, "Can I ask, how did this get to you? The data. How did you get access to this in a way that's reaching the right people?" Carlos looked at Mason. Mason said, Ms. Ashford met someone on a plane who happened to be looking at patterns in the industry data and recognized Ashford Logistics in the failure column. Joyce looked at him. That's an incredibly random way for this to surface. Yeah, Mason said. It is. He got back to the plan. He walked through the routing restructure, the reliability first protocol for medical freight, the rerouting away from the 4 overloaded hubs, the suspension of the extenuating circumstances classification. He explained why each piece mattered and what it would take to implement. Frank DeLuca, who had spent the first 45 minutes of the meeting in a defensive posture that Mason recognized as the body language of someone who had given up on meetings, started leaning forward somewhere around the hub, rerouting discussion. By the time Mason got to the priority protocol changes, he was asking questions, specific ones, the kind of questions that came from someone who knew their operations and was now seeing a plan that might actually address what they'd been watching for 2 years. The rerouting, Frank said. If we pull medical freight off Newark, Memphis, and Dallas, where does it go? Chicago South, Charlotte, and Richmond. All 3 are running at 60 to 70% capacity on the relevant route segments. They have room. Charlotte's carrier contracts are, I know, the carrier rates are about 8% higher. That cost gets offset by the reduction in failure-related losses within the first 90 days if the completion rates improve the way the model suggests. Mason looked at him. I can show you the projection. Show me. Mason pulled up the spreadsheet. Frank studied it. Ray Gutierrez leaned over to look. Joyce Chen asked about the API integration required to shift the routing parameters, and Mason said he'd need her specifically to help with that part. And something in Joyce's posture changed. The same thing he'd seen in Carlos. The shift from waiting to be dismissed to being actually used. That was 2 hours in. The 3rd hour was different. Frank DeLuca said, I want to say something off the record. Mason said, there's no off the record here, but go ahead. Frank looked at him for a second, then nodded. Fair. Okay. He clasped his hands on the table. There are people in this room who have known for a while that the numbers we were reporting didn't match what we were seeing, and there are people, not in this room, who knew that too and made specific decisions about it. He looked at Mason steadily. I want to know if those decisions are going to be addressed, because I've been in this company for 11 years, and I've watched good people, analysts, supervisors, drivers, raise real problems and get managed into silence. And if this, he gestured at the room, the meeting, Mason, is another version of that, I'd rather know now. The room was very quiet. Mason looked at Frank DeLuca. He thought about what Victoria had said the night before, about not walking into the NovaCare meeting with better-looking lies. I can't make you a promise about personnel decisions, Mason said. Those aren't mine to make. What I can tell you is that Ms. Ashford has seen the same data you're looking at, and she knows what it means. And the reason I'm here, and the reason Carlos's reports are finally in front of someone who can act on them, is because she chose to follow this thing to wherever it goes rather than manage around it. He paused. That's what I've seen of her. I haven't known her long, but that's what I've seen. Frank held his gaze for a moment, then he nodded. Not enthusiastically, but definitely. The meeting ended at 5:15. Mason stayed and talked to Joyce Chen for another 40 minutes about the systems integration piece, because it was genuinely complex and because Joyce was the kind of person who communicated best in a one-on-one context without 7 other people in the room. She walked him through the routing software architecture with a whiteboard marker and a slightly frantic energy that he recognized as someone who had been waiting to explain this to someone capable of understanding it. The algorithm's parameters are configurable, she said, drawing a box and labeling it optimization engine. We can switch the primary optimization variable from cost to reliability without replacing the whole system. I can define reliability as a composite of hub completion rates, route segment failure history, and transfer count. She drew lines. The medical freight flagging system already exists in the platform. We just have to reweight the priority logic so that flagged freight gets routed through the reliability-optimized paths. How long to implement? If I have full system access and someone in operations running point on the hub side? She thought about it. 5 days for the initial configuration, testing and validation another 3. 8 days, Mason said, if nothing breaks. What's the realistic version? 10? Maybe 11? 11 days, he looked at her. NovaCare's review is in 11 days. She looked at the whiteboard. Then I'm going to need to not sleep much. Will that work for you? She capped the marker. I've been watching this system fail for 2 years. Yeah, that works for me. He went back to the 31st floor and found Victoria in her office, alone. It was past 6. The building had gone quiet around the edges. The ambient noise of a full office had settled into the evening skeleton crew hum. She looked up when he came in. How did it go? She said. Better than I expected. He sat down. Your route managers know exactly what's wrong. They've known for a while. Frank DeLuca has 11 years in the Northeast Corridor, and he's been watching the same failure pattern. He just had no channel to move it through that wasn't being managed. He paused. Joyce Chen can implement the routing restructure in 10 or 11 days. She's going to need full system access and someone on the operations side running the hub coordination. Who do you recommend for the hub side? Anita Garza in Dallas. She already has the solution for the capacity fix in a report she wrote in July. He looked at her, and she'll actually implement it instead of sitting on it. Victoria wrote something on her notepad. And Phillips? Legal call his bluff on the documentation. I'll put together the full analysis of the extenuating circumstances classification, how it was designed, when it was introduced, how it was applied. That's the clearest evidence of deliberate reporting manipulation. He paused. What does he know about the timeline? He knows there's a review happening. He doesn't know the scope of what we have. She looked up. His lawyer called this afternoon. They're asking for a formal written statement of any allegations before they'll discuss anything. Standard move. I know. She set the pen down. I also know that every day he has system access is a day he can alter classification data. Did legal get back to you on the access question? They're working on it. She said it in a way that meant she was frustrated with the pace of it. Diane, Mason said. Victoria looked toward the door. Diane left at 6. She has a kid with a fever. Right. Tomorrow morning, first thing. Push legal on the access question. Frame it as an operational integrity issue, not a personnel one. You're not suspending him. You're restricting data modification access to protect the integrity of an ongoing operational review. He thought about it. Any competent employment lawyer can tell you that's defensible. Victoria looked at him. You know employment law? I know what I've seen in other situations. Other situations where an operations head spent 14 months burying reports? Somewhat different specifics. Same general shape. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. All right, I'll push legal first thing. She leaned back. Mason, the NovaCare call, I think I need to get ahead of it. Call them before the review. Tell them I know what the performance numbers show and that I have a plan. He thought about this. What do you think they'll do? Honestly, I don't know. Their procurement head is a man named David Ewan. He's been running their logistics contracts for 12 years. He's the kind of person who values honesty over reassurance. At least that's been my read of him. She paused. My alternative is to walk into the review with the numbers and the plan and hope they give me the meeting rather than just handing me a termination notice. And if you call them first, then I control the framing. I'm not waiting for them to tell me my numbers are bad. I'm telling them I know they're bad and here's what I'm doing about it. She looked at him. What do you think? He thought about it honestly. Call them, he said. You're right about UN. That type responds to accountability, and it gives you the chance to explain before they make up their minds. He paused. But be specific. Don't just say you have a plan. Tell them the routing restructure is underway, the implementation timeline, the expected performance improvement, the structural changes to prevent recurrence. Make it real. Will the implementation actually be underway by then? Joyce starts tomorrow if you give her the system access tonight. Victoria looked at her laptop, typed something. Done. Mason stood to go. Wait, Victoria said. She was looking at her screen, but her voice had a different quality. I got a call this afternoon while the route manager's meeting was going on. She looked up. NovaCare's procurement team. They've moved the review up. He felt it before she said the number. How far up? 6 days, she said. The review is in 6 days. The 6 days landed in the room with the weight of a dropped thing. Why? Mason asked. David Ewan's office said they'd received information that prompted them to want to review the contract status earlier than scheduled. She held his gaze. They didn't say what information. Mason stood very still for a moment. 6 days instead of 11. The routing restructure that needed 10 to 11 days to implement and test. The classification data that legal was still reviewing. The hub capacity solution that Anita Garza hadn't been officially brought in on yet. Phillips, he said. Victoria's expression was answer enough. He tipped them, Mason said. Or someone in his chain did. I can't prove that. No, but the timing. I know. She said it quietly. Not angry exactly, something harder than anger. The expression of someone who has just watched an adversary make a move they should have anticipated and didn't. 5 days of system access. Whatever he could modify, adjust, reclassify, I don't know what he changed. We need to pull the system logs from the last 5 days and compare them against the baseline data I have from Tuesday. Mason was already thinking through it. Joyce can do that. If he altered anything, we'll see it. Can we do that before the NovaCare meeting? We have to. He looked at her. Call David Ewan tonight. It's past 7. Call him anyway. He said it with a certainty he didn't fully feel but knew she needed to hear. Tell him you're aware the timeline has changed. Tell him you requested the meeting yourself. You don't want to walk into it reactive. You want to walk in like you called it. She looked at him for a long second. And if the performance numbers look worse because Phillips spent 5 days altering classifications back to make the raw data look worse, then we show them the baseline data, we show them the log comparison, and we show them exactly what happened to it and why. He held her gaze. The story you're telling NovaCare isn't our numbers are fine. This is what our numbers actually are. This is why they got this way, and this is specifically how we're fixing it. If you can document what Phillips did in the last 5 days, that's part of the story. Victoria was quiet. It's a harder story to tell, Mason said, but it's the true one. She picked up her phone. I'm going to call Ewan. He nodded and went to the door. Mason. He turned again. She had the phone in her hand but wasn't dialing yet. When I met you on that plane, you were looking at data about a problem in my company that nobody here had surfaced to me. Yes. And now Phillips has potentially made it worse by getting to NovaCare before we could. Possibly. She looked at him steadily. Are we going to be able to do this in 6 days? He thought about Joyce Chen with a whiteboard marker, and 5 days she was apparently willing not to sleep through. He thought about Frank DeLuca leaning forward in the meeting. He thought about Carlos, 26, updating the same report for 14 months and keeping the most current version ready. He thought about the fact that the answer she needed and the honest answer were very close to the same thing, which was not always true in situations like this. "I don't know," he said, "but we have better odds than we had a week ago." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she dialed. He stepped out into the hallway and let the door close behind him. The 31st floor was nearly empty now, just the faint sound of cleaning staff somewhere down the corridor and the hum of the elevator banks. Mason stood in the quiet for a moment and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the end of the hall. The darkness of it broken up into thousands of lit rectangles, thousands of buildings where people were working and deciding and making things harder or easier for each other without always knowing which they were doing. He thought about Richard Phillips in his office 5 floors down, still in the building, access partly restricted, lawyer already on the phone. A man who had built a system to protect something. His position, his judgment, the legacy of a dead man's company as he understood it, and had made it worse by trying to protect it. He pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Kowalski. "He's fine," she said. "I know," Mason said. "I just needed to hear you say it." A pause, warmer than silence. "How bad is it?" He looked at the city. "It got harder today." "You'll figure it out." "I don't know that." "Mason." Her voice was the specific firmness of someone who had survived things and didn't pretend otherwise. "Yes, you do." He stayed on the phone with her for a few more minutes, not saying much. Then he said goodnight and hung up and stood there a little longer watching the city. 6 days. He went back to the office and started working. Joyce Chen had a system, not a logistics system, a personal one. She kept a legal pad on the left side of her keyboard and a coffee mug on the right. And when she was deep in a problem, she wrote things down on the legal pad in a handwriting that got progressively smaller and more compressed the harder she was thinking. By the time Mason arrived at 7 the next morning, the legal pad had 3 pages of compressed notes, and the coffee mug had been refilled at least twice, and Joyce was staring at her monitor with the particular intensity of someone who had found something they weren't expecting. "You're early," Mason said. "I didn't go home." She said it without looking up. "Sit down. I need to show you something." He sat. She turned the monitor toward him. "I pulled the system logs from the last 5 days like you asked," she said. "Started at midnight." She pointed at a column of entries on the screen. "These are classification modifications. Anytime a route delay gets reclassified, it generates a log entry with a timestamp, the original classification, the new classification, and the user ID of whoever made the change." Mason looked at the log. The entries were dense, dozens of them, clustered in 2 time periods. Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday morning, both after his first conversation with Victoria about the routing failures. "How many changes?" he asked. 47? She said it with the flatness of someone who has had several hours to absorb a number that initially made them angry. 47 route delay classifications were modified in a 40-hour window. All of them moved from standard delay, which counts against performance, to operational constraint, which is a subcategory of extenuating circumstances. She paused. All 47 were medical freight routes. Mason stared at the screen. "The user ID on every single modification is the same," Joyce said. She pointed. PHL-0-042. That's Phillips's direct system credential. Not someone in his chain, him personally. His credential. Whether he was physically at the keyboard or gave someone his login, I can't say from the log. She looked at Mason. But 47 changes in 40 hours, all on medical routes, all moving in the same direction. That's not routine maintenance. Mason thought about the original 63% completion rate he'd found when he first reviewed the data. "What does the medical freight completion rate look like after these modifications?" Joyce typed. The number appeared. 71%. Still below NovaCare's 75% threshold, but dramatically better than the actual 63. And without the log comparison, without knowing what the numbers looked like before the modifications, it would look like a company that was close to meeting its contractual obligation and trending in the right direction. He didn't have enough time to get it above the threshold, Mason said. Or he was trying to get it close enough to argue he needed more time to improve. Joyce leaned back. "Either way, if we walk into the NovaCare meeting with the modified numbers and we don't show them the log, we're presenting data that's been deliberately altered." "We're not doing that." "I know. I'm just saying what he was counting on." Mason pulled out his phone. It was 7:14 in the morning. He texted Victoria. Need you on 31. Joyce found the log evidence. It's significant. Victoria's reply. 10 minutes. She arrived in 8, which meant she'd either been in the building already or she lived closer than he'd thought. She came in without her jacket, which for Victoria Ashford was the equivalent of arriving in pajamas. She was always assembled, always precise, and the absence of the jacket said she'd moved fast. She looked at the screen for a long moment without speaking. Then, 47. In 40 hours, Joyce said, after I confronted him. Yes. Victoria straightened. Something in her face went very quiet and very decided, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm changes direction. Legal, she said. Right now, I don't care what time it is. She looked at Mason. This is the documentation they needed. It's strong, Mason said. Time-stamped, user-attributed, directionally consistent. It's going to be harder to characterize as negligence with this in front of them. I'm not characterizing it as anything. She was already pulling out her phone. I'm having him walked out of the building this morning. Victoria, he said it carefully. Make sure legal agrees before you do it. Not because I think you're wrong. I think you're right. But if you move before legal clears it and his lawyer challenges the process, I know. She stopped, took a breath. I know. Legal first. She looked at Joyce. Can you export the full log with timestamps and send it to Diane by 8 o'clock? I'll have it to her by 7:30. Good. She looked at Mason. Novacare. David Ewan called me back last night. He'd wondered. He hadn't asked because she hadn't texted after the call, and he'd respected that. How did it go? He was guarded, not hostile. He said he appreciated that I was reaching out proactively. She chose her next words with care. He also said he'd received information suggesting the company's medical freight performance was significantly below the contractual threshold, and that there may have been reporting irregularities. Directly from Phillips's side. He wouldn't confirm that, but yes. She looked at the window. He gave me the 6-day timeline and said he'd be bringing their full procurement committee. Not just a standard review. She paused. It's a termination meeting unless I change the frame. Mason thought about this. The difference between a review and a termination meeting was the difference between being evaluated and being told the decision had already been made pending your response. UN giving them 6 days and bringing the full committee meant Novacare was prepared to cut the contract. They wanted to give Ashford Logistics the chance to make a case, but they were walking in with a conclusion. What's your plan for the meeting? Mason asked. I tell them everything. She said it the way she'd said things before that he'd come to understand she meant. What the actual performance numbers are, what caused them, what was done to obscure them and for how long, what I've done about it in the last week. She looked at him. And what the routing restructure will produce specifically, with a timeline they can hold us to. That's the right approach. He paused. The risk is that transparent honesty about internal data manipulation makes us look worse in the short term. I know the risk. Ewan may hear our operations head spent 14 months suppressing reports and then altered 47 data records and decide that a company with that internal dynamic is not a company he wants managing Novacare's pharmaceutical supply chain. I know that too. Her voice was steady. But the alternative is walking in there with cleaned up numbers and hoping they don't find out what's behind them, and they will find out. Whatever Phillips told them, they're already looking. She met his eyes. I'd rather lose the contract on true numbers than keep it on false ones. He looked at her for a moment. He thought that was probably the right answer and also a very hard one, and that the distance between knowing the right thing and being willing to do it was sometimes significant, and that Victoria Ashford was standing on the right side of it without making it look like a performance. Okay, he said. Then we build the best possible version of the true story. They worked through the morning. Joyce ran the log analysis and sent the export to Diane, and then immediately went back to the routing restructure implementation, because she was, as far as Mason could tell, constitutionally incapable of working on only one thing. Carlos came in at 8:30, and Mason put him on the performance projection model. Given the routing restructure parameters, What did realistic completion rates look like at 30 days, 60 days, 90 days post-implementation? Not optimistic numbers, actual numbers, with variance ranges. Frank DeLuca called in from the Northeast at 9:15. He'd heard from someone in the building, Mason didn't ask who, that things were moving, and he wanted to know what he could do. Mason told him to document the specific hub capacity constraints on his routes in writing, with timestamps on when they'd been observed, and send it directly to Diane by end of day. Frank said, finally, and hung up. Anita Garza in Dallas got an official call from Victoria's office at 10 o'clock. Victoria personally brought her in on the recovery plan and authorized immediate implementation of the capacity solution from her July report, the 2 additional sort lines and the priority protocol. Anita's response, according to Diane, who relayed it to Mason, was a long pause followed by, "I'll start the procurement paperwork this afternoon." The pause had been surprise, Diane said. Pure surprise. Dave Okafor in the Northeast Corridor got a similar call. He asked 2 questions. Is this real? And who authorized it? And when he was told the answer to both, he said he'd have his team briefed by end of week. Legal called Victoria at 11:15 and told her the log documentation was sufficient. Phillips was notified at 11:45 that his system credentials had been suspended pending an investigation into data integrity. His lawyer issued a statement at 12:30, characterizing the suspension as retaliatory and procedurally improper. Victoria's legal team issued a counterstatement that said less and said it more precisely. Phillips left the building at 1:15, walking through the lobby with a posture that Mason happened to observe from the mezzanine level because he'd gone down to get lunch from the cart and hadn't anticipated the timing. Phillips was 63 and walked like someone who was used to the particular authority that came from long tenure in a place. Even now, leaving under circumstances that were not his choice, there was something in the set of his shoulders that was not quite defeat, more like a man who had decided his version of events was the true one and was going to hold on to that. Mason watched him go and felt nothing particularly clean about it. He hadn't wanted Phillips to be the answer. He'd wanted the answer to be a routing algorithm and a software parameter. The human version was always messier. He took his lunch back upstairs and kept working. By day 3 of the 6, the routing restructure was in active implementation. Joyce had the medical freight priority logic reconfigured in the main routing engine, with the reliability-weighted optimization running on a parallel test environment that she was validating against historical route data. The results of the validation were, as she put it at the afternoon check-in that Mason had started running daily in Conference Room B, better than the conservative estimate and not as good as the optimistic one, which means they're probably real. Carlos presented the projection model. At 30 days post-implementation, his model showed medical freight completion rates recovering to 71 to 74%. At 60 days, 76 to 78%. At 90 days, the upper range of the projection reached 81%, which was close to where the reported numbers had claimed to be all along, except this time the underlying data would actually match. Is the 30-day projection good enough for NovaCare? Carlos asked. 71 to 74% is below their 75 threshold, Mason said, but trending correctly. Yes, Mason looked at the model. The question is whether UN and his committee are willing to give us a recovery window, or whether they need the number to already be above threshold. He paused. That's less a data question and more a relationship question. Carlos nodded. He was quiet for a second. Can I say something? Yeah. The 30-day number. It's conservative because the model assumes a gradual ramp on the hub rerouting. But if Anita gets the Dallas capacity work started this week, and Frank's team in the Northeast implements the new priority protocol on the flagged routes by end of week. He stopped, pulled up a secondary tab. I ran a version of the model with accelerated hub implementation. 30-day range moves to 74 to 77. Mason looked at the numbers. That crosses the threshold on the upper range. Upper range, yeah. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible. What does it depend on? Dallas and Northeast moving fast on implementation, and no major weather events in the next 30 days that could hit the rerouted paths. He paused. I can't model the weather. Nobody can, Mason said. He looked at the screen. Put together both versions, conservative and accelerated. Victoria needs to present both to NovaCare and be transparent about which assumptions drive which outcome. He thought about it. Ewan is 12 years in procurement. He's going to know the difference between a projection that's been dressed up and one that shows its work. I'll have both versions ready by tomorrow morning. Mason looked at Carlos across the conference table. 26 years old, 14 months of being right while nobody listened. Now building the model that the company's largest client was going to use to decide whether to stay. You know, Mason said, you should have had this job from the beginning. Carlos looked slightly uncomfortable with the compliment, which made it more genuine. I'm a junior analyst. You were a junior analyst who was doing senior work and getting junior treatment. Mason closed his notebook. That's going to change, but that conversation is between you and Miss Ashford. Carlos looked at him. Did she say something? She asked me what you knew beyond the numbers. He paused. I said I'd find out, and now I know. He stood. Go finish the model. The call with Victoria happened that evening, their daily debrief, which had developed a rhythm over the past several days. She looked tired in a way that was different from the airport, more specific somehow, the tiredness of someone who was tired of particular things rather than generally depleted. Legal sent the formal letter to Phillips's attorney today, she said, outlining the investigation scope. How did they respond? His lawyer is arguing that data modifications were within his operational authority as head of operations, that reclassifying route delays is a standard function of his role. She picked up her pen, turned it in her fingers. Which is technically true. The role does include classification authority. But the pattern of modifications, they're arguing the pattern is consistent with his normal operational judgment, that he was correcting misclassifications, not creating them. She set the pen down. It's going to be a long legal process. Mason thought about this. Is there any documentation of how the extenuating circumstances classification was historically applied? Before the last 5 days? Joyce is pulling historical usage data. We should have it tomorrow. If the historical usage rate is significantly lower than what he did in those 40 hours, then the argument that he was performing routine corrections becomes much harder to sustain. She nodded. Yes, that's what legal is building toward. Okay. He looked at his notes. NovaCare. 4 days. 4 days. She said it like she was holding the weight of it. I've been thinking about how to open the meeting. How? I want to start by telling them I know why they moved the review up. She looked at him. Not accusatory, just acknowledging it. That we're aware information reached them through an unofficial channel, and that I understand why that prompted concern, and that everything I'm about to show them is the actual picture. She paused. Does that seem right to you? He thought about it. It might make Ewan defensive if he's not prepared for you to name it directly. He's been in procurement for 12 years. He's not going to be thrown by directness. She said it with a confidence that suggested she'd done some thinking about David Ewan specifically. I'd rather have an uncomfortable first 2 minutes than spend the whole meeting with the thing unsaid in the room. Then do it that way. He looked at her. What's your read? Does he want to keep the contract? She was quiet for a second. I think he wants to keep it. NovaCare has been with Ashford Logistics since my father's time. That's not nothing. She paused. But he's not going to keep it out of sentiment. He needs a reason that holds up to his committee. The restructure plan gives him a reason. If he believes we can execute it. Joyce is executing it right now. I know. She looked at her desk. I'm going to ask him to come see it. Mason looked up. Come here? Before the formal review meeting, I want to bring Ewan to the building, show him the implementation in progress. Let him talk to Joyce, to Carlos, to Frank, on a call. She met his eyes. I want him to see that this isn't a slide deck. It's actually happening. Mason sat with this. That's a significant request to make 4 days out. I know. He might say no. He might. She held her ground. But if he comes and he sees what's actually being built here, the people, the work, I think that changes something. You can make a good presentation. You can't fake a whole operations team working. He thought about Frank DeLuca leaning forward in the meeting, Joyce Chen with her whiteboard and her compressed legal pad notes, Carlos's projection model with the variance ranges shown because he'd refused to dress it up. Anita Garza in Dallas already starting the procurement paperwork on the capacity fix. Call Ewan tonight, Mason said. Invite him for the day after tomorrow. Give him the full picture, what you're going to show him, and why you want him to see it. He paused. And tell him to bring whoever from his committee he wants. Don't make it feel like you're trying to separate him from his team. She was already picking up her phone. David Ewan said yes. He said it, according to Victoria's text at 9:40 that evening, with language that Mason interpreted as cautiously interested rather than convinced. He'd bring one person from his committee. He'd come the day after tomorrow. He wanted 2 hours. Mason texted back, "Good. Make sure Joyce knows." Joyce's response when Carlos told her, 2 hours? I can do a lot of damage in 2 hours. The day before Ewan arrived was the hardest one. Not because of anything specific, it was actually a day of progress on all measurable fronts. The routing restructure moved into the final validation phase. Anita Garza's Dallas procurement request was approved internally by noon. Frank DeLuca's documentation of the Northeast Hub constraints arrived in Diane's inbox at 2 o'clock, thorough and time-stamped, and exactly what Mason had asked for. Carlos finished both versions of the projection model, labeled them clearly, and added a methodology note that explained every assumption in plain language because he said if he were sitting across from this, he'd want to know exactly how the sausage was made. The hardest thing was a phone call Mason didn't plan for. His ex-wife Claire called at 4:15. He almost didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he was in the middle of reviewing Carlos's model and the timing was bad. But he answered because Eli was with Mrs. Kowalski, and if Claire was calling, it was probably about something real. Is Eli okay? He said. Eli's fine. I talked to him this morning. Her voice was the voice he still knew better than almost anyone's, careful, direct, with a warmth that was genuine even when they were being careful with each other. I'm calling because Mrs. Kowalski mentioned you've been in New York for almost 2 weeks. I have. Big thing? He looked at the projection model on his screen. Yeah. A pause. Are you taking care of yourself? Relatively. That means no. He could hear her almost smile. Eli told me you're fixing something broken. He said that? He said it like it was your whole personality. The almost smile became something more real. He's not wrong. Mason leaned back in his chair. I'm good, Claire, really. I'll be back by the end of the week. I know you will. Another pause. He misses you. I miss him. I know that too. Her voice shifted slightly. Do good work, Mason. He held the phone for a second after she hung up. He thought about the fact that Claire had called because Mrs. Kowalski mentioned he'd been gone nearly 2 weeks, and that meant Mrs. Kowalski had thought to tell her, and that these two women who had both spent significant time managing the consequences of Mason's problem brain had some version of a communication channel he'd never fully mapped. He thought that was probably a good thing, even if it was also slightly humbling. He went back to the model. David Ewan was 54, compact, with the bearing of someone who had spent his career evaluating things and had gotten very good at not telegraphing his evaluations before he was ready to deliver them. He arrived with a woman named Patricia Sue, who was NovaCare's VP of Supply Chain Risk, a title that described exactly the function she performed, which was to assess whether the thing in front of her was a genuine risk or a managed one. Victoria met them in the lobby. Mason stayed upstairs, which had been his own suggestion. This first hour was Victoria's meeting. He was infrastructure, not presentation. She brought them to Joyce first. Joyce had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, by being exactly as she was, which was extremely technically capable and slightly impatient with people who asked the wrong questions and visibly relieved when asked the right ones. She walked Ewan and Sue through the routing system architecture, the optimization parameter change, the validation results. She showed them the before and after on the test environment. She showed them the historical log comparison that demonstrated the 47 classification changes. She showed them everything, including the bad parts. The modifications in the log, Patricia Sue said, pointing at the screen, those were made by your operations head. By his system credential, yes, Joyce said. The investigation is ongoing on the specifics of that. And this is the data that was sent to... Sue stopped, glanced at Ewan. To whoever provided the information that prompted you to move up the review, Victoria said, from the chair at the side of the room. Steady, not accusatory. Yes, we believe the modified numbers are what was shared. These are the actual numbers. Ewan looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he looked at Victoria. You're showing me your internal investigation documentation. Yes. You don't have to do that. I know. She met his gaze. I'm doing it because the only way this conversation is worth having is if you have the real picture. Ewan was quiet. He had a quality Mason had observed in the best decision-makers, the ability to stay genuinely quiet while processing, without filling the space with words that were really just thinking out loud. Show me the restructure, he said finally. Joyce showed him. Then Carlos came in. Mason had suggested it and Victoria had agreed. Carlos presenting his own work, in his own voice, was different from someone else summarizing it. Carlos was nervous in the way of someone who knew how important the room was and hadn't had enough time to fully convert the nerves into something more useful. But his data was solid, and he knew it. And when Patricia Sue asked him a specific technical question about the variance methodology, the nervousness dropped away completely, and he answered for 4 straight minutes with the precise fluency of someone who had been living inside this problem for over a year. Sue looked at Victoria when Carlos finished. How long has he been with the company? 3 years, Victoria said. He wrote the first analysis in March of last year, Sue said. Not a question. Yes. And it didn't reach you until now. No. Victoria didn't cushion it. It didn't. Another silence. Ewan looked at his hands, then at the data still on the screen. What are you asking from us? A 90-day extension of the performance review window, Victoria said. Hold the contract in place for 90 days. At the end of that window, you evaluate our completion rates against the 75% threshold using the corrected reporting methodology. No extenuating circumstances classifications. Raw data. She paused. If we don't hit the threshold in 90 days, I'll agree to an expedited contract termination process. Ewan looked at Patricia Sue. Something passed between them that was quick and practiced. The shorthand of people who have been in a lot of rooms together making decisions. The 30-day projection, Sue said, looking at Carlos's model. Conservative range is 71 to 74. Yes, Carlos said. Accelerated implementation range is 74 to 77. Yes. Upper range crosses the threshold. What drives the accelerated scenario? Dallas Hub Capacity Implementation and Northeast Priority Protocol, both completed by end of this week. Carlos looked at the screen. Dallas is already in procurement. Northeast Protocol is being briefed to the team today. Sue made a note. She looked at Victoria. You understand that a 90-day extension is not a guarantee of renewal. I understand completely. And you understand that we'll be monitoring completion rates in real time against the corrected methodology. I'd expect nothing less. Victoria held her gaze. Patricia, we put time-sensitive medical freight on routes that weren't built for it, and we managed the reporting in a way that hid the failure. That's the truth of what happened here. I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm asking for the window to prove we've actually fixed it. She paused. If we haven't fixed it in 90 days, you should go. The room was quiet. Ewan said, I'll need to take this to the full committee. Of course. We'll have an answer by end of week. Victoria nodded. Thank you for coming. Ewan stood. He looked around the room, at the screen with the data, at Joyce's legal pad full of compressed notes on the credenza, at Carlos, who was carefully not showing that he was waiting for something. Then Ewan looked at Victoria. Your father built a good company, he said. It landed differently than he probably intended. Victoria was very still for a second. Then, he did. I'm trying to build a better one. Ewan held her gaze for a moment. Then he and Sue left with Diane. Mason was in the hallway. He'd come down 20 minutes into the session, positioned himself near the elevators where he could see the conference room through the glass without being in it, and had been there since. He'd watched Joyce at the whiteboard. He'd watched Carlos's body language shift when Sue asked the technical question. He'd watched Victoria sit in that chair and not soften a single thing. He was still in the hallway when Ewan came out. Ewan saw him, paused, looked at him for a moment with an evaluating expression that said he knew Mason was connected to this even without the introduction. "Consultant?" Ewan said. "Independent," Mason said. Ewan nodded slowly. "That analyst, Carlos." "Yes." "Make sure she keeps him." He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the elevator with Patricia Sue, and the doors closed. Victoria came out of the conference room 30 seconds later. She looked at Mason. "How much did you hear?" she said. "Enough." He paused. "You did well." "I told them everything." "I know. I don't know if that's going to be enough." "Neither do I," he said. "But you told them the truth, and you showed them actual work, and you asked for a reasonable window with clear consequences. That's the best version of this conversation." She looked down the hallway where Ewan had gone. "He said my father built a good company." "He did." "I almost couldn't answer that." "I know, but you did." She was quiet for a moment, then, "End of week. We'll know by end of week." The next 2 days moved with the specific quality of a held breath, work continuing because work was the only thing that helped, but with a current of waiting underneath everything. Joyce completed the routing restructure implementation and ran final validation on Thursday evening. The validation results landed at 72 to 75% projected completion rate for the first 30 days, which was the overlap between the conservative and accelerated models, which meant Carlos's numbers were holding up under the actual implementation conditions. Anita Garza called Mason directly on Thursday afternoon. She said the first additional sort line in Dallas was operational. She said her team had worked double shifts to get it done, voluntarily, because, she paused to find the right word, because it felt like something that actually mattered. Mason said he'd make sure that was in the report. She said she didn't care about the report, she cared about the freight getting where it needed to go. And he said that was the same thing, and she said maybe, and hung up. Frank DeLuca sent a message through the system on Friday morning saying the Northeast Priority Protocol was fully briefed and in effect as of 6 a.m. Mason sat in the borrowed office on the 31st floor on Friday afternoon and looked at the pieces of the thing they'd built in 6 days. It was imperfect, messy at the edges, dependent on assumptions that could shift, built at a pace that created its own risks. Joyce had flagged 3 integration points that needed follow-up attention in the next 2 weeks. Carlos's model had variance ranges that were honest but uncomfortable. Anita's Dallas fix was operational, but the second sort line wouldn't be complete for another 10 days. But it was real. That was the thing. It was actually real. His phone buzzed at 3:47. Victoria. NovaCare confirmed. 90-day extension. Full committee vote. He sat with that for a moment. Then he texted back. Good. Her reply. That's all you've got? He thought about it. It's a start, not an ending. Tell Joyce. 3 minutes passed, then Victoria sent a single message. She cried. Then she went back to her integration notes. Mason looked at that for a moment. He thought about Joyce Chen, who hadn't gone home the first night and had spent 6 days building something real out of a system that had been making things worse, and who had apparently cried about it for approximately 30 seconds before returning to her legal pad. He thought about Carlos, about Anita and her double-shift team in Dallas, about Frank DeLuca, 11 years in the Northeast Corridor, who'd spent the last week doing the work of 2 people because something had finally reached the person who could do something about it. He thought about Richard Phillips, who was gone from the building but not from the legal process, whose 9 years of decisions were now being documented in a way that would take months to fully untangle. He thought about Victoria, sitting across a table from David Yuen and Patricia Sue and telling them the truth without cushioning it, because she'd decided that was the only version of the conversation worth having. He picked up his phone and called Mrs. Kowalski. He's fine, she said. I know, Mason said. I'm coming home tomorrow. A pause, warmer than words. He'll be glad. Tell him not to stay up. Mason! Her voice had the tone of someone who has been managing 11-year-olds long enough to know exactly how that instruction would be received. I'll tell him. He hung up and looked out the window. New York in the late afternoon had a particular light, low and golden and slightly dusty, the way cities look when they've been at it all day and are just starting to think about winding down. He opened his notebook and turned to a blank page. He wrote, "Things still broken." He thought about it. Then he wrote, "The parts that can't be fixed in 6 days. The legal process around Phillips. The cultural damage of 14 months of managed information. The way it had taught people at every level of the organization to expect that what they said would get filtered, softened, redirected. The question of how many other Carloses were out there in other divisions, updating the same report every month into a silence that told them nothing useful. The routing restructure was real. The NovaCare extension was real. But the thing under all of it, the organizational belief that it was safe to say true things that wasn't fixed in a week. That was months of different decisions accumulating slowly, building a different kind of pattern. He wrote, "Ask Victoria about what comes next." Then he put the notebook away and started writing up the full consulting report. Not the one for Victoria's leadership team, but the one for himself. The one he always wrote at the end of a job to document what he'd found and what he'd missed and what he'd do differently. The what he'd missed section was always the longest. He wrote for 2 hours, and when he finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling of the borrowed office and thought about the fact that he'd fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder over Pennsylvania, and somehow that had led here, to this room, to this notebook full of routing failures and suppressed reports, and the small, real victories of people doing the right work after a long time of being told it didn't matter. He didn't think that was tidy. He didn't think there was a clean lesson in it. He thought it was mostly just the way things happened, chaotic and sideways and dependent on a series of accidents that could easily have gone differently. But here they were. He closed the report, shut his laptop, put the notebook in his bag. He had a flight in the morning. He was on the 7:15 back to Chicago. The gate at LaGuardia was different from the one he'd left from 2 weeks ago. Different terminal, different carpet, same burnt coffee smell that Mason had come to think of as the baseline scent of American airports, the olfactory equivalent of a holding pattern. He had his bag, his notebook, and a coffee from the same cart in the lobby that he'd been using every morning for 2 weeks, because he'd stopped trying to find a better option around day 4. He sat in the gate and looked at his phone. There were 11 unread messages, which was light for a Friday morning. 2 from Greg Holt at Meridian, one asking about the Friday update he'd promised, and one following up on the first. 3 from various contacts about other projects that had been waiting. One from his landlord about a maintenance issue in the building that he neither owned nor had caused but was apparently expected to have opinions about. One from Eli, sent at 6:47 in the morning, which said only, "What time does your flight land?" Mason wrote back, 9:15 your time. Why are you awake? The reply came in 40 seconds. Couldn't sleep. Mrs. K made French toast. Go eat your French toast. Already did. Twice. Mason looked at that for a moment, and something in his chest did the thing it always did when Eli was being exactly himself. A kind of warmth that was so familiar it was almost painful, the feeling of loving something you can't protect as completely as you want to. I'll be home by 10, he wrote. Save me nothing. I'll get something at the airport. K. Also, Mom called last night, I know. We talked. She said you were fixing something big. Mason looked at the gate. The flight was boarding in 20 minutes. Around him, people were doing the particular choreography of airport waiting. Laptops out, shoes off. The unconscious negotiation of shared armrests. Yeah, he wrote. It's mostly fixed. Mostly? He thought about the legal process that was still ongoing. The 90-day window that NovaCare had granted, which was real but not permanent. The organizational trust that had been damaged over 14 months and would take longer than 6 days to rebuild. The parts of the what he'd missed section that still sat in his notebook. The parts that can be fixed in a week are fixed, he wrote. The rest takes longer. A pause. Then, that makes sense. Get ready for school. It's Saturday, Dad. Mason closed his eyes briefly. Right. Get ready for nothing. I'll see you at 10. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the gate. He'd said goodbye to Victoria the evening before. Not dramatically. There hadn't been a dramatic goodbye in him, and he didn't think she'd wanted one either. They'd had a final debrief in her office at 6 o'clock, gone through the handoff documentation, talked through the things that still needed attention in the coming weeks. He'd left a full written report on her desk. The complete picture, from the routing failures to the classification system, to the implementation results, to the open items that needed follow-up. He'd organized it so that someone could pick it up and understand the whole problem and the whole response without needing him in the room to explain it. That was the job. Come in, find the problem, build the fix, document it so it survives your departure. He was almost to the door when she'd said his name. He'd turned. She was standing behind her desk, and she had the look she sometimes got when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. "I want to offer you a contract," she said. "Formal, 1 year. You'd run the operational recovery, finish what you started here, build out the direct reporting structure, help us find and address the other places where this kind of drift might be happening." He'd known this was coming. He'd been half thinking about it for days, the way you think about something you haven't decided on yet, but your brain is already processing in the background. "The compensation would be," she started. "It's not the compensation," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a second. "Eli. He's 11. He's in school. He has a life in Chicago that doesn't need to be disrupted for his father's work." He paused. "I've already disrupted it enough." "What if it didn't have to be a disruption?" she said. "You don't have to be in New York every day. Most of this work, the reporting structure, the operational review, the hub monitoring, it's not physical. It's calls and data and the occasional site visit." She held his gaze. "And when you need to be in New York, we cover travel. When Eli has something important, a school thing, a game, whatever it is, you're there. No questions, no coverage required. The work bends around that, not the other way around." He looked at her. "I've watched you work for 2 weeks," she said. "And I've watched you call Mrs. Kowalski every night. I've seen you check your phone for texts from an 11-year-old with the same attention you give a routing analysis." She paused. "I'm not asking you to choose between the work and your son. I'm asking you to help me build something worth choosing." He'd stood in the doorway of her office for a long moment. "Let me go home," he said finally. "Let me see Eli and sleep in my own bed and think about it for a week." "Take 2 weeks," she said. "Take whatever you need." He'd nodded and left. And now he was at Gate B7 at LaGuardia with a paper cup of coffee and a boarding pass and the specific unsettled feeling of someone who hasn't made a decision yet but can feel the shape of it forming. The flight boarded. He found his seat, 18A this time, window, because he'd upgraded on points and taken the empty row, and settled in and watched the runway slide past as they taxied, and thought. He thought about Carlos Reyes, who had a projection model on his laptop that had just helped save the company's most important contract, and who was still technically a junior analyst. He thought about what a year of actually being listened to might do for someone like that. He thought about Anita Garza in Dallas, whose July report had been the right answer 14 months ago and was now being implemented. He thought about Dave Okafor in the Northeast and Frank DeLuca and Joyce Chen with her legal pad and her compressed notes and her 30 seconds of crying and then back to work. He thought about the organizational culture that Victoria was trying to build, the one where information moved because people trusted it would be used, not filtered. That was not a technical problem. That was a human problem, and human problems required sustained human attention, the kind that couldn't be handed off in a report and walked away from. He thought about the fact that he was good at this. Not just the data analysis and the routing restructure, but the other part, the part where you sat across from Frank DeLuca and convinced him that this meeting was different from the others. The part where you told Anita Garza that her July report had finally reached someone who read it and heard the pause that followed and understood what that pause contained. He thought about Eli, who thought his father's whole personality was fixing things that were broken and who said it without judgment, with the particular acceptance of a kid who has simply observed his parent long enough to understand what drives them. He fell asleep somewhere over Ohio. He woke up over Indiana, with no one's shoulder involved this time, and the pilot was announcing their descent into O'Hare, and Mason sat up and looked out the window at the flat winter brown of the Midwest spreading out beneath the clouds, and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, like he was going in the right direction. Mrs. Kowalski had Eli ready at the door when Mason's cab pulled up. Not in a formal way, ready in the way of a kid who'd been watching from the front window and tried to make it look like he hadn't. Eli was in sweats and socks and the hoodie he wore approximately 4 days out of every 7, and he came through the door before Mason had finished paying the driver and managed about 2 steps of casual before just stopping and waiting on the front walk with his hands in his pockets. Mason got out of the cab, looked at his son. Eli was taller. Not dramatically, maybe half an inch since August, but enough that Mason noticed it the way he always noticed it, with a small jolt of something that wasn't quite grief but was adjacent to it. The speed of it. The way it happened while he was busy looking somewhere else. "Hey," Eli said. "Hey." Mason picked up his bag. "You're taller. You say that every time you come back from somewhere." "Because it's always true." Eli looked at him with the assessing gaze he'd had since about age 7, when he'd apparently decided to start taking people seriously. Then he crossed the remaining feet of front walk and hugged his father in the direct, unself-conscious way that Mason knew would eventually become complicated by adolescence, but was, right now, just what it was. Mason put his arm around his son and held on for a second. "You okay?" Eli said, muffled by Mason's jacket. "Yeah," Mason said, "I'm okay." Mrs. Kowalski was in the doorway with a look of complete satisfaction that she was making no effort to conceal. "She'd made pierogi," she said. "They were on the stove. Was he staying for lunch?" He stayed for lunch. They ate at her kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Eli talked about the Brooklyn Bridge for 17 minutes with the sustained enthusiasm of someone who has found a subject they intend to fully exhaust before moving on, and Mrs. Kowalski contributed observations about New York that she delivered with the authority of someone who'd visited twice in 1987 and considered herself an expert, and Mason ate 2 bowls of pierogi and drank a cup of coffee that was the best coffee he'd had in 2 weeks, because it was made in a kitchen he recognized and handed to him by someone who'd been feeding him in moments of need for 3 years without ever making it feel like charity. He walked back to his own apartment in the early afternoon, put his bag down, stood in his kitchen, which was smaller than any room he'd been in at Ashford Logistics headquarters, and had a cabinet that didn't close properly and a window that looked out at the neighboring building's brick wall, and stood there for a while just being in it. He called Greg Holt. Greg answered with, "The Friday update. It's Saturday." "I noticed. I'll send it Monday. Full documentation." The client situation turned into something more extended than expected. "I know. I saw the news." Mason paused. "What news?" "Wall Street Journal ran a piece yesterday. Ashford Logistics CEO overhauls operations amid performance failures, removes top executive. Didn't name the consultant." A pause that was almost a smile. "I assumed." Mason hadn't known about the article. Victoria hadn't mentioned it, which meant either she hadn't seen it yet or she'd let him leave without the distraction of it. He didn't know which, but both were plausible. "I'll send the report Monday," Mason said. "Yeah," Greg said. "Take the weekend." He hung up and found the article on his phone. It was 3 paragraphs, sourced to a company statement and 2 anonymous people familiar with the matter. It said that Ashford Logistics had initiated an internal review of its medical freight routing operations, that senior operations executive Richard Phillips had departed the company, and that CEO Victoria Ashford had announced a restructuring of the company's performance reporting methodology. It quoted Victoria directly, 1 sentence. "We identified failures and how critical information was reaching leadership, and we are building the structures to make sure that never happens again." Mason read that sentence twice. It was exactly right. Not polished right, where the language has been so carefully shaped that it stops meaning anything. Actually right, the way something is when the person saying it has had to earn the understanding. He set the phone down. He spent the weekend being home. Took Eli to the hardware store on Saturday afternoon because Eli had decided he wanted to build a model of a suspension bridge and needed materials, and they spent 45 minutes in the lumber section with a tape measure and a sketch Eli had made on notebook paper. And the store employee who came to help them was a man named Gerald, who got genuinely invested in the structural integrity of the model and contributed 3 suggestions that Eli wrote down with the seriousness of an engineer taking notes. On Sunday, they went to the museum. Not for any particular exhibit, just because it was the kind of day that needed somewhere to go, and the Natural History Museum was Eli's default answer when the question was open. They moved through the halls at Eli's pace, which was slow and nonlinear and involved reading every placard, including the ones that were clearly just filler text. Mason followed him and didn't rush him and thought about almost nothing professionally for 4 consecutive hours, which was the closest thing he had to a vacation. Sunday night, after Eli was in bed, Mason sat at his kitchen table with the contract offer in his head and finally thought about it directly instead of sideways. He thought about what he was being asked to do and whether he was the right person to do it. The first question was easier than the second. The organizational recovery, the direct reporting structures, the operational monitoring, the culture work. He could do that. He'd been doing versions of it his whole career, just in shorter windows without the continuity that made the work stick. 1 year of continuity would make things stick differently. The second question was harder. The right person. He was a consultant. He came in, found the problem, built the fix, wrote the report, left. That was the job. That was the shape of his professional life for 8 years. The value of it was partly the independence. Being outside the structure meant he could see the structure. Being inside, even temporarily, changed that. But Victoria wasn't asking him to be inside. She was asking him to help build something and then leave it capable of running. That was different. That was closer to what he'd actually done in the last 2 weeks. Not just fixing the specific routing failures, but finding the people who'd been right all along and making sure they had the position and the authority and the channels to keep being right after he was gone. Carlos, Anita, Dave, Joyce, Frank. Those were the people who would hold it together after him. He'd been finding them for 2 weeks and putting them in positions to be useful. If he stayed for a year, he could make sure that held. He could build the monitoring systems that would catch the next drift before it became 14 months of suppressed reports. He could help Victoria develop the instinct for what healthy information flow looked like, so she could recognize its absence without needing an outside consultant to come tell her. And he could do it while being home for Eli's school events and whatever Eli decided to build next, and the Saturday afternoon trips to the hardware store where a man named Gerald got invested in bridge structural integrity. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and typed, "I've thought about it. I'll take the contract. 1 condition." He sent it and looked at the time. 10:47 on a Sunday night. Victoria's reply came in 4 minutes. "Name it." He typed, "Carlos Reyes gets a formal promotion and a title that matches what he's actually been doing. Before I start. Not as a condition of his performance going forward, as recognition of what he's already done." A longer pause this time. 2 minutes. Then, "Done. Anything else?" He thought about it. "One more thing. The hub supervisors, Anita Garza, Dave Okafor, they get direct reporting access to your office. Not a suggestion box. Not a monthly report that goes through 3 managers. Actual direct access, established in writing before the end of the month." Another pause. Also done. He looked at the screen, then typed, "Then I'll start the week after next. I need 1 week at home first. You have it. Thank you, Mason." He set the phone down. He sat with the decision for a moment, checking its weight, the way you check a thing you've committed to before the adrenaline of deciding wears off. It felt right in the specific way that things feel right when they're not entirely comfortable. Not the easy right of a decision that costs you nothing, but the other kind. The kind where you can see what you're giving up as clearly as what you're gaining, and you choose anyway. He went to bed. He slept for 9 hours, which was more than he'd slept in a single night in 2 weeks, and woke up to Eli knocking on his door at 7:30 to ask if they were making pancakes, or was Mason going to sleep until his brain melted, which was apparently the threshold Eli had decided on. They made pancakes. The week he'd given himself at home was quiet and specific and exactly what he needed. He worked in the mornings, writing the report for Greg, doing the documentation handoff for 2 other consulting projects that were still technically active, making notes for the Ashford work that would start the following week. In the afternoons, he was available, which was a different thing from being present and which he was trying to close the distance between. He went to Eli's school on Wednesday for a presentation Eli's class was doing on infrastructure projects. Eli's contribution was 5 minutes on suspension bridge design, delivered with a model he'd built from the hardware store materials and Gerald's structural suggestions. It held together. The teacher asked a question about load distribution that Eli answered correctly and with confidence. Mason sat in the back row of a 6th grade classroom and watched his son explain cable tension to a room of 11-year-olds and felt something that he did not have a precise word for but that sat in the vicinity of gratitude, complicated by the full awareness of how many of these moments he'd missed and how much he intended that ratio to change. After the presentation, walking back to the car, Eli said, "Were you actually watching or were you thinking about work?" "I was watching." "The whole time?" "Cable tension," Mason said. "Load distribution. Gerald's suggestion about the anchor points was good." Eli looked at him sideways. Gerald's suggestions were structurally sound but aesthetically unnecessary. "That's a very advanced critique." "I'm advanced." He kicked a pebble off the sidewalk. "Are you going back to New York?" "Next week? But different this time." Different how? Mason thought about how to explain it to an 11-year-old in a way that was true without being complicated. "This time I have a set schedule. I'll be home most of the time. When I need to go to New York, it'll be planned, not emergency. And when you have something important," he looked at Eli, "I'll be here." Eli was quiet for a moment. He had a habit of processing things without filling the silence, which he'd gotten from Mason and which Mason recognized with the particular discomfort of seeing your own patterns reflected. "The school play is in March," Eli said finally. "I'll be there." "You said that last year." Mason stopped walking. Eli stopped too, hands in his hoodie pocket, looking at him with the direct honesty of a kid who had learned that sugarcoating things didn't actually make them better. "I missed it last year," Mason said. "That was wrong. I'm sorry." Eli looked at him for a second, not forgiving, not withholding forgiveness, just looking. Then, "Okay. I mean it about March." "I know you do." Eli started walking again. "You also mean it when you say you'll be home for dinner and then something comes up." "I know." "I'm not saying that to be mean." "I know that too." Mason fell into step beside him. "I'm trying to get better at it, imperfectly, but actually trying." Eli was quiet again. Then, "Mrs. Kowalski says you're the most well-intentioned person she's ever met, who is also the most easily distracted by other people's problems." Mason looked at him. "She said that?" "Last week, when you'd been gone 10 days. He glanced up. "She said it like it was a compliment and also a diagnosis." Mason thought about Mrs. Kowalski, 71, who had spent 3 years covering the gaps in his parenting without ever making him feel worse about them than he already did. He thought about the specific wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to see the same human patterns repeat and had decided that pointing them out gently was more useful than pointing them out harshly. "She's not wrong," Mason said. "I know," Eli said. "I still want you at the play." "March," Mason said. "I'll be there." He started in New York the following Monday. The rhythm of it was different from the first 2 weeks. Not the emergency tempo of 6 days and NovaCare and Phillips's system logs, but something more sustainable. He was in New York Tuesday through Thursday most weeks, home Friday through Monday. He had a standing call with Victoria on Monday mornings and a standing call with the hub supervisors, Anita, Dave, and now 2 others who'd been brought into the direct reporting structure, on Thursday afternoons. Carlos had been promoted to senior operations analyst and given a reporting function that put his work directly in front of Victoria's weekly review. His first formal report in the new capacity ran 40 pages and contained a recommendation about the carrier rate structure in the southern routes that saved the company 8% on contract renegotiation. Victoria sent Mason a 1-sentence text. "He's going to be running something important in 5 years. Mason replied, 3. The legal process with Phillips moved slowly, the way legal processes do. His lawyer continued to argue that the data modifications were within his operational authority. Victoria's legal team continued to document the pattern, the timing, the gap between his stated rationale and the actual function of the extenuating circumstances system. It was not resolved quickly, and it was not clean. In March, Phillips accepted a settlement that included a formal acknowledgement of the reporting failures and a non-disclosure agreement that his lawyer insisted on, and Victoria's team agreed to because the acknowledgement was what mattered, and the legal cost of continuing to fight for more was not worth it. Mason was in Chicago when Diane sent him the settlement summary. He read it on his phone in his kitchen, standing by the window with the view of the neighboring building's brick wall, and thought about what an acknowledgement meant when it was produced by legal process rather than conscience. He thought it meant less than the real thing and more than nothing, and that was probably the honest answer for most human accountability that happened through institutional channels. The routing restructure held. That was the thing Mason kept watching, the way you watch a repair you've made for the first signs that it's coming undone. At 30 days, medical freight completion rates came in at 74%. Upper end of the conservative projection, lower end of the accelerated one. At 60 days, they were at 77. At 90 days, when NovaCare conducted its formal review, the number was 79%, and the trend line was still upward. David Ewan sent a short email to Victoria after the review. Mason saw it because she forwarded it to him with no comment, which was its own comment. Ewan wrote that NovaCare was pleased with the recovery trajectory and would be renewing the contract for a further 2 years, subject to quarterly performance monitoring. He wrote that he appreciated the transparency they'd been shown during the review process. And he wrote, one sentence at the end, "Please convey my regards to the analyst who presented the projection model. His methodology was sound." Victoria's forwarded email had no message attached, just the UN email, and then below it, in the subject line she'd modified when she forwarded it, "Told you 3 years." Mason laughed at his kitchen table, actually laughed, the same way he'd laughed at gate B14 at 11:34 at night, alone, at a text from his son. He forwarded the UN email to Carlos with the subject line, "From the procurement head of your largest client, no other message." Carlos's reply came back in 6 minutes. "Okay, wow." Then, "Do I respond to him directly?" Mason wrote, "Ask Victoria." "But yes, you can." The other healthcare clients stayed. 2 of the 4 contracts up for renewal in Q1 renegotiated with improved terms, which Mason understood was partly the routing restructure and partly Victoria's willingness to have honest conversations about what had happened and what was being done about it. The 3rd renewed on existing terms. The 4th asked for a 6-month review period, which Victoria agreed to, and which by April had converted to a full renewal. The company did not become perfect. Mason would not have believed it if it had. He'd been in enough organizations to understand that institutions are made of people, and people have the full range of human qualities, including the ones that make things harder, and no restructure or reporting protocol eliminates that. There were friction points in the hub operations that needed attention in February. There was a software update in March that created an unexpected gap in the priority flagging system that Joyce caught and fixed in 48 hours, but not before a small batch of temperature-sensitive freight was misrouted. Nobody pretended that hadn't happened. Anita Garza filed a report about it within 6 hours. Victoria read it the same day. That was the difference. Not the absence of problems, the absence of silence around problems. Mason thought that was the only thing that actually worked, in organizations and in families and in the other complicated arrangements people made with each other. Not perfection, not the performance of everything being fine, just the willingness to say the true thing when you saw it, and the structure that made saying it safe. He was in New York in April when Victoria asked him to come up to her office at the end of the day. It was a Thursday, his last day before the weekend, and he came up at 5:30 with his jacket on and his bag on his shoulder because he was catching the 6:15. She was at the window when he came in. The city was going that particular gold dark of spring evenings, when the light has warmth in it again, and everything looks slightly better than it probably is. 4 months, she said without turning. About that. She turned. She looked different than the woman on the plane, not more composed. She'd been composed on the plane, in the particular way of someone managing a great deal internally, but less managed, somehow, like some energy that had been going toward maintenance was now going somewhere else. "The board reviewed the Q1 results this week," she said. "I know. They want to talk about the company's long-term strategy, the medical sector positioning specifically. She looked at him. They asked about the consultant who led the operational recovery. What did you tell them? I told them you were finishing your contract in July and that I was working on what came next. She paused. They asked if you'd be willing to present to them in June. Mason looked at her. What would I be presenting? Your read on the company, where it is, where it could go, what the structural foundations look like now versus 8 months ago. She held his gaze. Your honest read, not a sales presentation. I don't do sales presentations. I know, that's why I want you to do it. He thought about it. I'll put something together. Thank you. She looked back at the window. Mason, after July, after the contract ends, what are you going to do? It was a direct question, which he'd come to expect from her, but it still took him a moment because he hadn't fully answered it to himself yet. Go back to independent consulting, he said. Probably. I have projects lined up. Greg's been patient. Greg can wait a little longer if something else made sense. Something else meaning Ashford logistics. Something else meaning whatever makes sense. She turned back to him. I'm not going to make the pitch again. You heard it in September. My situation hasn't changed. I still think you're the right person for the long work here, but I also think you know what you need better than I do. She paused. I just want you to actually think about it rather than defaulting to what you've always done. He looked at her. She meant it, which was the thing about Victoria Ashford. She consistently meant what she said, which was rarer than it should be in people at her level. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. He caught the 6:15 with 4 minutes to spare, which was tighter than he liked, and found a window seat and watched New York fall away beneath the clouds as they climbed. He thought about what she'd said, rather than defaulting to what you've always done. He thought about the 9 years of independent consulting, the parade of broken systems he'd walked into and walked out of, the reports that were thorough and the work that was real, and the never quite resolved question of what it would feel like to stay somewhere long enough to see what he'd built actually stand. His phone buzzed. Eli, are you coming home tonight? Landing at 8:30, Mason wrote. Why? The bridge model fell apart. I need a second opinion. On the structural failure? Yes, obviously. Is this urgent or can it wait until I get home? A pause. I mean, technically it's already fallen apart, so it's not going to get worse. I'll see it at 9. K. Also Mrs. K left soup. Mason put the phone down and looked out the window at the dark. He thought about Gerald's suggestions about the anchor points and whether they'd held and what Eli's diagnosis of the failure would be, and whether he'd already started making notes on the redesign, which he almost certainly had. He thought about a lot of things on that flight. He thought about them until somewhere over Ohio when he stopped thinking about them deliberately and just looked at the dark outside the window and let his brain do whatever it was going to do without trying to direct it. When the plane landed and he walked through O'Hare, he called Mrs. Kowalski to let her know he'd landed, and she said, I know Eli's been watching the flight tracker for 40 minutes. And Mason said, of course he has, with the specific warmth of someone who finds the thing they love predictable in all the right ways. He drove home, parked, went up the stairs with his bag, knocked on Mrs. Kowalski's door, and Eli opened it before the knock was finished, which confirmed the flight tracker information. Eli looked at him with the assessing gaze, then apparently decided he was satisfactorily intact and said, Come look at the bridge. The bridge was on Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen table. It had come apart at one of the main cable anchorages, which Eli explained in precise detail while pointing at the failure point with a pencil. His diagnosis was that the anchor attachment had insufficient surface area at the connection to the deck structure, which was structurally accurate and which Gerald had actually warned them about in the hardware store, but which Eli had overruled on aesthetic grounds. Gerald was right, Mason said. Gerald was right, Eli agreed, without apparent distress. I'm going to redesign the anchor plate. Do you want help? Eli looked at the bridge, then at Mason. Yeah, actually. They sat at Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen table until 10:30, the three of them, because Mrs. Kowalski pulled up a chair and made tea and offered opinions that were occasionally structurally dubious, but always confidently delivered. And they worked on the bridge. It wasn't a perfect evening. The anchor plate redesign required 3 attempts before Eli was satisfied, and Mason's second attempt was worse than the first, which Eli pointed out without mercy. Misses. Kowalski's tea was very strong in a way that Mason had never managed to acquire a taste for and drank anyway. Eli was tired by 9:30 but refused to admit it and became progressively more stubborn about the anchor plate specifics as a result, which required some careful navigation. But the bridge held in the end. Eli tested it by adding weight to the center span, carefully, a small piece at a time, and it held each piece. And when it held the last one, Eli sat back in his chair with the expression of someone whose faith in a correct structural theory has been vindicated. "Gerald's anchor plate," he said. "Gerald's anchor plate," Mason agreed. Mrs. Kowalski said she'd always trusted Gerald. They cleaned up the kitchen table, and Eli went to bed with the specific crash of someone who'd been running on stubbornness for the last 90 minutes. And Mason helped Mrs. Kowalski wash the teacups and didn't say much, and she didn't say much either, because they'd been doing this long enough that they knew when words were necessary and when they weren't. At the door, she said, "You look better than you did in September." "Different kind of tired," Mason said. "Better kind." She looked at him with the directness of someone who has earned the right to it. "Whatever you're deciding, it'll be right." "You don't know what I'm deciding." "No," she agreed, "but I know you. And I know that when you take the time to actually decide something instead of defaulting to what's familiar." She stopped. "You usually get it right." He looked at her. "Did you tell Victoria Ashford that?" "I've never met Victoria Ashford." "You basically gave me the same speech she did." Mrs. Kowalski smiled, small and complete. "Sensible people often notice the same things." She held the door. "Go to bed, Mason." He went home, stood in his kitchen for a moment, in the quiet of his own apartment, with the cabinet that didn't close and the window with the brick wall view and the specific silence of a place where someone lives alone and knows every sound it makes. He thought about what Victoria had said, about what Mrs. Kowalski had said, about what Eli had said 3 weeks ago on the sidewalk. "I still want you at the play." March had come and gone. He'd been there. He'd sat in the 3rd row of the school auditorium and watched Eli play a supporting role in a production of a play about a lighthouse keeper with the focused commitment of someone who takes every task at face value. And he'd clapped at the right moments and laughed at the right moments and not checked his phone once. That was not a transformation. That was one school play and a year of trying harder, and it was not enough to make up for the ones he'd missed, and it was a start. He thought that most of the important things in his life were starts, not conclusions, not finished things. Starts that required sustained attention to become something more, which was the difference between fixing a system and building one. He sat down at his kitchen table, pulled out his notebook, opened it to a blank page. He wrote at the top, "What I know." He thought about it for a while. Then he wrote, "The routing restructure works. The people are in the right places. The reporting channels are established. Victoria knows what healthy information looks like now because she's been watching it move for 8 months. He paused. What she still needs, someone to run the long operational work for another year or two while the culture solidifies. Someone who knows where the bodies are buried and can watch for the early signs of drift. Someone the hub supervisors trust because they've seen him follow through." He looked at what he'd written. He wrote, "What Eli needs." He held the pen above the page. Then, his father home most of the time, present when it matters, imperfect but actually trying. He looked at both lists. The thing was, and he'd known this somewhere since that conversation on the sidewalk about the school play, the two things were not incompatible. They'd never been incompatible. He'd spent 8 years treating them as incompatible because it was easier than believing you could actually do both, because believing you could do both meant you had to try. And trying and failing was harder than just not trying. He closed the notebook. He picked up his phone. He texted Victoria. "I'll sign the extended contract, 2 years, not 1. Same terms, same flexibility on family schedule. But I want one thing added." It was 11:40 on a Thursday night. He didn't expect a reply until morning. Her reply came in 3 minutes. "What do you want added?" He typed, "Formal mentorship structure for Carlos, Anita, and Dave. written into the contract scope. I'm not just fixing the operational problems, I'm building the people who'll run this without me. A pause. Then, you were always going to do that anyway. I know, I want it written down. Done. Anything else? He thought about it, then typed, No. That's everything. Then we have a deal. Get some sleep. He set the phone on the table. He looked at the kitchen, the cabinet that didn't close, the window with the brick wall, the cup from Mrs. Kowalski's tea that he'd accidentally brought home, and thought about the fact that 8 months ago he was a tired man in a wrinkled shirt in Gate B14 at O'Hare, reading a routing analysis he hadn't been able to finish, about to fall asleep in the wrong direction and wake up having started something he hadn't planned for. He thought about the fact that none of it had been smooth. The legal process was still running. The NovaCare relationship was real, but had a 2-year horizon after which it would need to be earned again. The organizational culture at Ashford Logistics was better, and not yet what it needed to be. Carlos was good and still learning. Anita had fixed Dallas and would have new problems in 6 months. Phillips was gone, and the full accounting of what he'd done would never be completely clean. He thought about Eli's bridge on Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen table, redesigned twice and still not perfect and holding weight anyway. He thought about Gerald's anchor plate. He thought that the thing about building something, really building it, not just patching it, was that you had to be willing to stay at the table until the anchor held. Not forever, not at the cost of everything else, but long enough. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. And for the second time in 8 months, in a place that was exactly where he was supposed to be, Mason Reed fell asleep without meaning to. And this time, there was nothing to miss.